Senate Chamber. Signed. 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 Senate Chamber. Signed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, members, welcome to the 55th meeting of the Public Accounts Committee in this mandate. Can I advise all members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast through Parliament buildings and online. However, there could be a slight delay between moving between any public and private sessions, so please be patient with the system. And I also advise anybody who will be joining us in the gallery that they're most welcome, and they can use their mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and all devices are muted. You can also find the Wi-Fi details on the gallery rules, and it is not permitted to take photographs or record any part of today's proceedings. We'll proceed as follows. Pleased to say we have no apologies. We have a full house, all members, except or Assistant Clerk Kirsten, who's watching online. So hello, Kirsten.
Oh, Kirsten.
And members, you're all very welcome. I think it is important always that we have people in person for evidence sessions. It does add a lot to the session, and I think as a team we get more out of it. So good to have full house, and it's good to have everyone here. Members, can I refer you to the draft minutes? There's a copy of the meeting held on the 23rd of October at pages 7 to 10 of the meeting pack. If members are agreed, for those who were present, that's a reflection of the meeting held on that date, I'll sign them.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, members, it is important at all times to remind members to ensure that they've considered the full agenda or the meeting, and that any relevant declarations are made early in the meeting to ensure they're recorded in open session. So at this point, I'll ask members if they have any declaration to make. Padraig?
Just members of family who are GPs and members of the BMA as well.
Yeah, thanks, Padraig.
Sure, APS, the Communities Minister, Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Colum?
I'm working on developing a members' bill in relation to homelessness.
You're the Chair of Communities as well, I suppose?
Yeah, Chair of Communities Committee, absolutely. Thank you, Chair.
Any other? Okay. I'm a director of a company that owns rented property as well, so I just put that in there. Okay, members, can I take this opportunity to express my thanks to the Jersey States Assembly for hosting our committee at the BAMR PAC network event last week. The event provided lots of learning, and a full report will be provided in the coming weeks. I have to say it was a very enjoyable visit, as always. The committee got on exceptionally well, not just as a committee representing this place we all represent, but also in building relationships with our counterparts and other PACs as well. It was very enjoyable, and it was great to have Kirsten and Lucia with us, and for keeping us right, and of course the CNAG for joining us on that very worthwhile trip. Members, during the visit and on the second night, I, as chair of this committee, offered, following a discussion with the members in attendance, to host the BAMR PAC network event in the Assembly here next year, subject obviously to business approval and obviously subject to the approval of this committee. It is a worthwhile event. I think it's an important opportunity to showcase how we operate as a committee, how well we operate together, and obviously see if there's any learning for other PACs from how we operate as we have learned from them. So are members in agreement or have any comment to make in relation to formally extending an invitation to host on behalf of the committee next year?
Thank you, Chair.
Go ahead, Cal.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And listen, yes, I thought it was a very good exercise, Chair, and there's a lot to learn for this committee. And I mean, it's good when you hear different areas, how in jurisdictions, how they operate. And I think there's a couple of things that's come out of it that we'll investigate ourselves. And I certainly would support your proposal. I think it's our turn to host, and obviously we're a good committee, and I think we'll make good representation. So thank you very much.
David?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the learning we got for others of how they track the changes and the stuff coming through, how we work cross-departmental, is really, really useful for us, especially when the kind of siloed assembly. And I absolutely support. I think it'd be really good for us to have. It would also enable all of the committee to participate in that, rather than just the couple of us that are there. So happy to support you.
Good.
Yeah, support the request to have hosted next year. And again, as others have said, there was a number of issues that came out of the conference that we had, a number of good issues that we can certainly look at and take on board and maybe tie into the work that we're doing here.
Thank you, Tom.
Absolutely, Chair. I thought it was a really worthwhile visit and opportunity to hear some best practice and explore different items of common interest. So I think it's really appropriate that we host it next year. It's a good call.
Members all agreed that we host next year and extend a formal invitation?
Great.
Okay. We'll discuss the finer details at a later point once we have the invitation sent out. Okay, members, can I refer you to page 3 of the table pack to correspondence from the Department of Finance in relation to the expert review of public procurement governance arrangements. The Department of Finance have now appointed an expert panel to review the procurement governance structures in response to a recommendation. In our recent report on public procurement, the chair of the panel is Professor Chris McCrudden, KC. He'd like to meet with the chair, with the deputy chair and I over the coming weeks in relation to this. Can I ask members the content that Diane and I both meet with him? Yeah, thank you. Okay, members, at agenda item 5, matters arising, and I refer you to page 14 of the meeting pack, which corresponds from Mike Farrar, the accounting officer for the Department of Health. The members considered this briefly at last week's meeting. Mr. Farrar advises that the best practice guide being overseen by the GP Access Working Group, making all contracts count, has now been finalised and was disseminated to all GP practices on the 10th of October 2025. A copy of this guidance was also provided to the committee. Members, are you content to defer consideration of this until agenda item 9 under access to GPs? Okay. Members, also at page 136 of the meeting pack is further correspondence from Mike Farrar confirming that he will attend to provide members with an update on mental health services in Northern Ireland on the 15th of January 2026, so as soon as we come back in the new year. Members content?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, members. Agenda item 6 corresponds to page 138 of the meeting pack. There's correspondence from a member of the public raising concerns regarding the Northern Ireland housing executives and an alleged breach of their statutory duty. Are you content, members, that we write to the correspondent advising that as the matters raised relate to the correspondent's personal circumstances, it falls well beyond the remit of this particular committee, and if the member of the public wish to pursue these concerns, they should raise them with NIPSO if the matter relates to maladministration. Members content with that recommendation?
Right, Chair.
Okay. Refer members to 141 of the meeting pack. There's correspondence from Dennis McMahon confirming his attendance on the 10th of December to provide evidence on our inquiry into road openings by utilities. Mr McMahon will also be joined by Mr Colum Woods, the Deputy Secretary of Transport and Road Asset Management, and Mr Colin Sykes, Director of Road Asset Maintenance. Members content to note that information? Okay, at 145 of the meeting pack, there's correspondence from Jane Brady, the Northern Ireland Civil Service Board. Can I ask members that are content to note today and bring this correspondence back at a later date in advance of Neil Gibson's attendance before the committee in the new year? Okay, great. At page 5 of the table pack, there's correspondence from the Minister of Health to the Business Office regarding indemnity arrangements in support of the Royal College of Physicians' participation in the Department of Health Neurology Review Phase 3. The Department has sought the support of the Royal College of Physicians to support the review of neurology patients through conducting an expert review of the second cohort of deceased patient records. As required by the appropriate guidance, the Accounting Officer and the Department of Finance approval has been sought and secured for this indemnity. Also, in accordance with guidance, the Public Accounts Committee has been copied into the correspondence. Members content to note? Okay, at page 7 of the table pack, there's correspondence from Housing Rights requesting a copy of the terms of reference into our inquiry for homelessness in Northern Ireland. Members content to forward this? Dan?
Yeah, Chair, was it our intention to publish this?
No, that's why I brought it to the committee, because I know it was just an internal working document, which I think the intention was for future inquiries that it would be something that could be made public. So this is the first request for it. So I thought it would be appropriate just to bring it to the committee to see if you'd be happy to share, or even a summary of it.
So are members content to reply to say that we are currently piloting this and at this stage we're not in a position to release the terms of reference subject to review of the process?
Yeah, Chair, I just wanted to raise, as others may not have known, to ask for it if we haven't published it for all. That was my only concern, but like I'm happy to send it on or do whatever, but I just wanted to check because I couldn't remember what we had agreed in terms of that.
We've agreed not to publish it subject to see how it works for the committee. I think it's probably better at this stage that we consider this a pilot exercise until such times as members are satisfied. From what I gathered from the previous session, members weren't clear on how the process would work and didn't want a terms of reference to I suppose, narrow our scope as an investigative committee. So it's probably best that we put that under review and subject to further consideration at a later date. We'll consider publishing depending on how the process works.
Okay, just perhaps to be helpful to this organisation who want to submit written evidence. If you're content, I could just write back and say the key areas that the committee is exploring which are the ones today, which is temporary accommodation, prevention, funding and supply, and then that would at least give some guidance on what they could send in.
Okay. Happy enough, members?
Yep.
Okay, at agenda item 7 is our inquiry into homelessness in Northern Ireland.
Sorry, just before you go into that, could I add to my register of interest today on property which I receive rental income from?
Thank you. Okay, members, agenda item 7 is our inquiry into homelessness in Northern Ireland. The evidence session, members, all relevant documents are in your packs. The suggested questions guidance is at pages 179. The Department for Communities biographies of those who will be joining us is at pages 183 to 186. The Northern Ireland Housing Executive witness biographies at pages 187 to 188. The Northern Ireland Audit Office report on homelessness in Northern Ireland at page 189 to 255. And thank you to the Audit Office for providing this very important report on the work that's been done. There's also an Audit Office briefing paper on homelessness in Northern Ireland, pages 256 to 265. And then the inquiry terms of reference, as just discussed, pages 266 to 268. Can I refer members also to page 9 to 15 of the table pack to a written submission from the Chartered Institute of Housing in Northern Ireland. And can I ask members who content to note and publish as evidence alongside the final report? Okay, members, just before we welcome in our guests, can I ask that members try and keep their line of questioning as direct and as succinct as possible? We have quite a lot to get through. We have a number of witnesses that are going to be before us. If members have any particular question that they want to follow up from another member, please just indicate and I will be as flexible as humanly possible. And we will go from there. Okay, members? Can I welcome to the meeting at this opportunity Mr. Colum Boyle, the Permanent Secretary for the Department of Communities, Mr. Paul Price, the Acting Deputy Secretary for the Housing and Sustainability Group, Ms. Grainia Long, Chief Executive for the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, Catherine McFarland, Director of Finance, Audit and Assurance in the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, Stuart Stevenson is also joining us from the Treasury Officer of Accounts, Department of Finance, and also Dorinnia, Carville, our Controller and Auditor General, and colleagues from the Northern Ireland Audit Office. You're all very welcome. It's great to see you and to have you with us. We do deeply appreciate your time. I'll just invite you at this point, in whatever appropriate order, to make some brief opening remarks. Members do have quite a lot of questions. A lot of it will come out in the questions, so we'll go from there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Many thanks for requesting that DfC and the Housing Executive appears before the committee today. We welcome, together with our strategic housing partner, the Housing Executive, the opportunity to focus a spotlight on the critical issue of homelessness within Northern Ireland. We fully accept the recommendations from the NIAO in respect of their report, and have already been active for some time in taking forward the necessary actions to improve how we deliver on our statutory and public service delivery obligations with regard to homelessness. It is very helpful and informative to see the challenging context of homelessness called out in the NIAO report, in particular because this highlights a backdrop which reflects the soaring demand and costs for temporary accommodation arising from COVID-19, the significantly increased rental costs in the private rented sector, the reduced capacity of the private rented sector as landlords leave the sector, the very difficult and constrained budgetary climate being faced by both DfC and the Housing Executive, putting pressure on the available funding to take forward very important homelessness prevention work, and the relatively small but growing number of households with leave to remain in Northern Ireland reporting to Housing Executive requiring homelessness services. In summary, the complexity of homelessness as an issue has deepened considerably and requires a strategic and operational response which DfC, together with the Housing Executive and also engaging with other departments and other organisations, has been actively engaged in for some time. It's important also to recognise that Northern Ireland is not the only jurisdiction affected by the challenge of finding secure and permanent sustainable accommodation for people who find themselves homeless. But we see the scope for improvement identified in the NIAO report and acknowledge that and welcome that. And we can respond to any questions to the committee on points emerging from the NIAO report. Thank you.
Thank you. Grainia, would you like to add? Or?
Thank you, Chair. Yes. So, afternoon, members. Thank you for your time. I think it'll be entirely appropriate that we spend some time today on assurance and systems and processes, and that's absolutely right. I think as housing professionals, our own view would be that homelessness is a profoundly human story, and so I suspect over the course of this afternoon we'll also hear that focus that we've had, the profound effect of homelessness on child development, on young people in particular. So as accounting officer, I'm acutely aware of our legal obligations. Over the last number of years, I think we are unique in not having failed in our legal duty, and I think that's an extremely important point. And everything that we've done has effectively been on ensuring that we meet our legal obligations to people who are often at their most vulnerable. And we have not overspent our budget, and that's acutely a critical area of concern for myself as accounting officer and obviously for my colleagues. The Housing Executive is a £1.3 billion organisation, and so in an organisation that big, sometimes homelessness could be seen as a side issue, and it is not. In the Housing Executive, it is the highest risk in our risk register. It is an issue that is discussed at length by our executive team, by our audit committee, by our board, and we have gripped the issue, and it is not an accident that on the basis of all of that homelessness presentations in Northern Ireland are reducing, and that makes us unique on these islands. We've reduced the number of placements in temporary accommodation. We have prioritised the quality of our temporary accommodation. 80% is own front door, and the profound effect that has on people in ensuring high quality accommodation is really important to state. We have controlled spend on temporary accommodation, and we have saved the public purse in the last 3 years 13.8 million on the basis of the steps that we have taken, and I think it's really important that we are able to highlight for you today and give you the assurance on that basis. We have also, and I thought at one point we would never be able to say this, we've reduced the unit cost of hotels and bed and breakfast accommodation by 11%. And our use of bed and breakfast and hotels is 30% lower than in England. So that is the focus of a huge amount of work by my organisation in partnership with the department. There's much more that we can say. But of course, and I think the Audit Office report has been very helpful in setting this out, in doing that we've had to make trade-offs and we've had to make decisions about where we put our resources, our people, our time and our money. And I think the report has been very, very helpful in shining a light on the areas now that we need to improve on, and I look forward to a discussion on that. The next phase of our homelessness strategy must ensure sufficient funding for that strategic shift towards prevention, the development of housing first and other models, because we need to move very large numbers of people out of temporary accommodation. We need to resource case management, that person-to-person service that we've been unable to resource at the scale that we've needed to, and of course we need significant additional capital funding. I'm sure we'll come on to all of that, but fundamentally we welcome this report. The work that we've done is person-centred, and it is focused on ensuring that we do not fail in our legal duty. 2 nights ago, a family in temporary accommodation was attacked, and that family have had to deal with the effects of that, and our teams on the ground will do that and deal with that over the next number of days. So homelessness absolutely remains an area of absolute priority for the organisation, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you both for keeping your opening remarks brief. Paul and Catherine, you will have an opportunity to come in, I suppose, as we proceed through the line of questioning from individual members, and you're both very welcome as well. Just before I ask a few questions, my line of questioning is relevant to you both at this stage. But just for the sake of public record, how many people as of today are homeless in Northern Ireland?
Yes, so as of today there are, in terms of full duty applicants, that the numbers have grown and they now stand at 31,719. So that's the number of people who have the highest level of protection afforded to them under the homelessness legislation. Our homelessness legislation has a wide definition, and we can come on to that if you like.
And how many of those 31,719 are in temporary accommodation?
So currently, as of, we'll say March of this year, 5,412.
Okay. And how many of those people are without anywhere to live that you're aware of?
So there will be, we undertake a rough sleeper count. Are you talking about people who literally have no roof over their head?
It depends how it's defined, because there's often an illusion There's people sofa surfing and all sorts, but how many of those are an absolute critical need?
Yeah. So we would determine anybody who is statutorily homeless is somebody that we have a duty to, okay, and we provide temporary accommodation to 5,124 of those people. And I suppose that's the reason why I would say those people are most in need if they cannot make other arrangements. Part of the reason we saw the growth in demand for temporary accommodation after the pandemic was we had very high numbers of people who were legally homeless, had come to us, we'd assessed their need, but were sofa surfing and were asked then during the restrictions applied during COVID to move out of that accommodation. So the soaring demand that we've seen in the last number of years is precisely, I think, Chair, what you're getting at, which is those people who were not able to make their own arrangements were sofa surfing and needed to come to us. So well over 5,000 households are in temporary accommodation, and there are between 70 and 80 people who will sleep rough. And we undertake a rough sleeper count every November. We will have updated figures on that, but I think that is a very different cohort, and I'm very happy to come back to that.
The 31,719, and I'm starting with figures, Grainia, deliberately because this is a human story. Mm-hmm. Out of the 31,719 people that is that individual people?
Or that's households, so that is households.
So that figure is much more significant.
Oh, absolutely it will be, yes. And I suppose there's often a discussion about why do we count people and why do we not count households. And of course the reason for that is the response to homelessness, or part of the response to homelessness, of course, is a housing response. So we need to be able to measure housing need, and the Housing Executive has a really important role in measuring housing need on the basis of the number of homes we need to provide. So I wouldn't in any way want to take away from the fact that beneath that 31,719 is a larger number of people, but that's a household number, so just to be clear.
And do the Housing Executive keep a record of individuals within that figure? So for instance, quite a lot of people over the age of 18 are remaining at home now to their 30 for many reasons, not being able to get a mortgage, not having access to good opportunities, etc., not having access to housing. Mm-hmm. So they're really stuck at home, I suppose, as a result of those issues. And I'm just wondering, have you got an actual breakdown of individuals out of that 30? Those 31,000?
Yes, we do, and we're often asked for it. And so we've in fact, I seem to remember the Simon community, when they launched their recent strategy, 3-year strategy, asked us for data on the total number of people. We're able to give it to them. In some households, you may have, for example, children living in 2 households. So so part of the reason we publish this data on the basis of households rather than individuals is because sometimes there are people who live in 2 households, often children. Yes, we gather that data. We can certainly make that available to you. It is a fairly, I suppose, time-consuming exercise to make that available because the system requires us to count households. But I'm very, very happy to write to you and provide you with that.
You don't have it with you today?
No, I don't have it with me today.
Have you any idea?
Well, normally I'm just on the basis of what I was taught as a housing professional, a household multiplied by 2.4.
That's a substantial figure.
Yeah.
On that.
That's and just to say that's the basis on which we operate in the Housing Executive.
You just run the numbers on that for me. Okay, and just a final question for me before I even get into this. The demographic of those homeless. Mm-hmm. So is there a specific trend in the demographic of household or individual that has been affected disproportionately by homelessness in Northern Ireland compared to any other?
So, if you're asking me about the total numbers of people, it's about 48% of households require 1-bedroom accommodation, so they will be either single people or couples. I think separately, the answer to your question is there a group that is disproportionately affected? Certainly there is, and they are people with a range of complex needs. So people who, well, first of all, I would say children are probably the most profoundly affected by homelessness. Older people, and people with any range of needs, physical or mental health needs, and again we can come on to that. So, but to answer your question in the clearest sense, the largest group currently that come to us in need of homelessness assistance are single-person households, and they make up 40%.
Is that largely men?
Yes.
So what? Can you give me an indication of the percentage difference there? Because certainly, I'm sure members will be picking up a similar issue. It is very difficult to get single men accommodated.
Yeah.
Can you give us the figures?
Yeah. So 48% Our single person households, the majority of those would be single men. Again, I can follow up on that, and if I have it in my file over the course of today, I certainly will give it to you. We are seeing a small but steady increase in the number of single women who are presenting with complex needs. And in fact, we have a number of pieces of work, a significant work stream in our chronic homelessness work stream that is focused on women and chronic homelessness.
Okay. And just by the calculation, Grainia, the figure you said multiplied by 2.4, that would leave an estimate of 76,125 individuals.
Full duty applicants, yes.
Which is a huge figure. Yeah, okay, that's grand. Okay, so given the soaring costs of temporary accommodation, you referenced this in your opening remarks in relation to progress that has been made. The increase in homelessness households on the social housing waiting list and the reduced focus on prevention in recent years, has the homelessness strategy failed, in your opinion?
No, I don't believe the homelessness strategy has failed, and I don't think there's evidence to suggest that it has. I think, I suppose, what I will always say is housing is about people and it's about numbers. And the great thing about housing is you can tell what's working through the numbers. Okay, so there are a number of things that have happened in the last number of years. The first thing is when the pandemic hit, well, there have been 3 shocks. The first one was both a demand and a supply shock after the pandemic. We had a large number of providers who provided homelessness accommodation who had to reduce the numbers of people they could house because of the restrictions. We also had large numbers of people who were already homeless, as I said, and who at the time didn't need temporary accommodation from the housing executive, but then suddenly needed it very, very quickly. So we went from 3,000 placements a year to 10,000 placements a year in an 18-month period. I've never seen anything like that in my career, and I've worked outside of this jurisdiction as well as here. That was the first shock. The second shock was, and we will all remember it, the economic shock that followed the pandemic. So we had a different group of people came to us, and they were mainly, or to a large extent, families who lost their tenancies in the private rented sector. You may remember, in fact I remember writing to Colum about this back in 2022 when we began to see very, very quickly landlords either stepping out of the market or indeed defaulting on their mortgages. That remains an issue today. And so we saw, as I say, to a large extent, families coming to us. So a different group of people, different cohort, different set of needs. The third shock is more recent. It's much smaller. And that is the numbers of people who have come to us from outside Northern Ireland since the Home Office has accelerated their leave to remain decisions. So those 3 shocks together have left a situation whereby pre-COVID 3,000 temporary accommodation placements a year are now at 11,500 temporary accommodation placements.
So is it the case, Grainia, that the strategy as written is not designed for such challenge?
No, I think what the strategy has had to do is it's had to emphasise or shift its emphasis on from all 3 pillars onto 1 pillar. So the strategy is made up of 3 pillars: prevention, support and sustain. Now prevention we will come on to, but prevention is not something that we've been able to fund. We haven't received the funding that we needed from the department in relation to that. We received prevention funding, but not sufficient. The second is to support people while they are homeless and to give them the type of accommodation when they needed when they were homeless. And the third then is to deal with chronic homelessness. So to answer your question, what we've needed to do over that period of 3 shocks is really focus as much people, time and money on that second pillar, which is how do we ensure that we have the accommodation available to us to meet that need, that, as I say, extraordinary levels of need, unprecedented levels of demand. And so what we did was we moved fast. Our teams moved very, very quickly to increase the portfolio of temporary accommodation that we needed. And in doing so, we made 2 very important decisions, which I think have stood us well. The first one was we decided that we would work so that the majority of temporary accommodation in Northern Ireland would be own front door accommodation. And that is more expensive, but it is more sustainable. And the upshot of that is that we are beginning to see the number of placements reducing every year. So people, when they go into that temporary accommodation, it's more suitable for them. They're not moving around as much. That is saving money to the public purse, and we can see the effects of that. The second decision that we took that I'm very proud of is the fact that we took the decision that we would not place children in hotel accommodation, and if we did, it would be for no longer than the period of 2 weeks. Now that's a KPI we set ourselves. It's a voluntary KPI. We weren't required to do that by law. We weren't required to do it by policy. It was the right decision. It has cost money because the knock-on effect of not doing that has meant needing to find suitable temporary accommodation. But as of today, we're in a situation unique on these islands whereby 1% of the total placements in temporary accommodation are to children in hotels. Now that is unique in Scotland, in Wales, in England and in the Republic of Ireland. And as of today, the average length of stay is 15 days. Now Scotland set that target. Scotland no longer meets that target, but Northern Ireland meets that target. That has cost. But as an accounting officer, my responsibility is, and my personal responsibility is to achieve value for money for the public purse, not just my organisation. And so we took that seriously, and we have saved health without question. We have saved education without question and criminal justice without question in relation to those two decisions. So that focus on, I suppose, disproportionately having to focus on one element of that strategy, one pillar, difficult though it was, not having the funding for prevention has meant much, much higher quality of accommodation. And as I say, you can see in those figures the fact that in this year we've now begun to see for the first time in many years the number of placements in temporary accommodation going down. And the numbers of people overall in bed and breakfast beginning to come down, and we've reduced the unit cost, so the cost of hotel accommodation, by 11%. And so they are three, I think, demonstrators of the fact that strategy has worked.
Okay, and you've mentioned in relation to one of the bills, how much is the prevention funding as of today?
As of today, so we bid for 4.5 million and we've received 2.7. 2.7. Now that's for strategic prevention. Again, I want to be very clear here. That is a particular type of prevention that is aimed at upstream prevention. Okay, there has been other prevention funding available. So the Supporting People programme, which is an extremely important programme. It exists in Northern Ireland. It doesn't exist elsewhere. That has been maintained. It has been maintained very, very well over the last number of years. Providers will, of course, and rightly and understandably say that it has not increased quickly enough to meet the costs that they meet. But the fact that 36% of the Supporting People budget is spent on homelessness does show that there is a prevention fund there, and then there was a wider community-based prevention funding that continued throughout. So I wouldn't want to give the committee the impression that the only prevention budget is that 2.7 million. There are other prevention budgets, and I'm very happy to cover that in more detail.
Yes, for the record, it's still less than what was bid for and what was needed.
And we bid each year, so over the last number of years, we bid each year in our annual bid to the Department for prevention funding.
Okay, thank you, Grainia. Colum, as Permanent Secretary for the Department, do you believe that the homeless strategy has failed?
I think the homeless strategy was written for a particular time, and it was written for a particular type of homelessness. And I think from the shocks that Grainia has outlined, I think to see that massive increase in the number of people who require temporary accommodation, that has outstripped where the strategy actually is. I think the strategy has had to go into full emergency mode for a period of time. And I think the fact that Grainia is describing how she's starting to crest the figures and starting to see the numbers go down is testament that we've got a level of control over that. I don't think any strategy, with the best will in the world, would have equipped us for what was coming over the hill at us after COVID. But I think the speed of response, the agility of response has been fantastic. It's been a situation, I think, as well, which I would like to make the point about. The Department and the Housing Executive have worked very closely together. We have a very, very strong partnership. I think one of the finest between a department and an ALB. It's not cosy. There's challenges in there, and we're very robust in that. But it's very businesslike and very professional, and we can get things done. So whenever Grainia was speaking about the Supporting People budget, we made sure we protected that budget. We made other sacrifices in terms of the department's budget to make sure that that was sustained. And we did the same thing with making sure that more money became available for homelessness prevention so we could actually start to meet the costs of the temporary accommodation. And we forensically went into the Housing Executive and had a very hard look ourselves to see, is there anywhere else the Housing Executive has got money where it could put into this? And they didn't have. And we had to do that in terms of due diligence, which we did it very, very quickly. So to answer your question, I think the strategy was good. I think the strategy has a lot of good characteristics in it. But I think it was sorely tested, and I think once you get into emergency mode, I think being able to step outside of that and really focus in, particularly on the temporary accommodation piece, I think we've done that very, very well.
And what would your, and very briefly on this particular point, what would your assessment be of having 76,125 individuals as what's the correct term, Grainia, statutory homeless?
Full duty applicants.
Full duty applicants.
Yeah, it's way too many people. And I think as a society, we would want to have an awful lot less than that. But as a society, we need to be able to fund that, to respond. And I don't think we have enough funding available to do that. I understand the difficulty that our executive face with so many different pressures across the public sector. And there are so many things we could say we would love to fund more, but we don't have the money. And there's a very difficult prioritisation for them, so I do not envy their task, and we respect fully what they do. But this is one which, for me, I think, and I worked in benefits for a very, very long time, having a roof over your head is a fundamental in life. And having your own roof over your head and that roof being permanent and sustainable is a right. And I think there's more that we can do, but it will require money to do it.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything more urgent than someone having the security of their own home. And we've referenced figures quite a bit in the opening of the session, and I've referred to a crude calculation of 76,125, but my own office has just reached out to me there and said the estimate actually, if we're being realistic about it, could it be anything from 75,000 up to 136,000 adults in Northern Ireland living in this situation because they've no other options or opportunities. So the figure is very, very damning, and it points to either a strategy that can't cope with the demand or one that can't deliver at all, and that's really where we're focused. So I have a follow-up question. There's been a range of strategies, Colum. You and I have had this discussion on different aspects before. There's been a range of action plans in relation to homelessness and consultations. However, the assessment at the grassroots level from our public would be that there's been little progress made towards the main strategic objectives on homelessness in Northern Ireland. So is there too much planning and discussion and not enough action being taken?
Very good question. I think there's a number of ways you can answer that question, and I think one of the ways is you can look at all the jurisdictions around us and see how they're coping with the same question and the same set of problems. And I think from that point, in relative terms, I think we've done reasonably well. I think we've done very well. And that's not making light of homelessness as a problem. I think we have got to understand that whether you're south of the border, England, Scotland and Wales, exactly the same set of problems exist. And not only that, but in terms of the statutory obligations that the housing executive have to put temporary accommodation and put roofs over people's heads, they meet that. The task as well is to make sure that as a accounting officer, that is done within budget, it's met. My task as an accounting officer in DfC is to make sure that the budget that I provide and whatever else I raid within the DfC budget to enable this, there's been action taken there inside DfC. There's been action taken within the housing executive to actually try and do the very best we can. And I think in these islands we've done incredibly well. That doesn't mean to say there's not a chronic problem facing us, because there is a chronic problem facing us. So I think, again, to try and take that forward, if you were to try and deal with that in a much more strategic way, there are a number of different levers that have to be pulled, and they all require significant funding. And it's not just one in isolation. For example, you mentioned earlier on about young men with complex needs and mental health issues. I mean, huge problem. And we're seeing, I'm having conversations with permanent secretary colleagues about this on a regular basis now. So we're talking about the health, about what needs to be done to try and alleviate that problem. You were saying earlier about saving health money, but there are issues there where health need to come into bat, and they appreciate that, they see that, they are coming to that. I'm very welcome to do that as well. So that's pretty positive. So I'm seeing a new dispensation amongst permanent secretaries to get involved in that. I'm certainly seeing it at ministerial level, and we have a minister who's absolutely focused on this, who wants to make a difference and wants to actually see a lot more action than planning. The last thing he does is plan a thing to death and talk it to death. He wants outcomes and he wants results, and that's what we've been trying to give.
Okay, thank you. I've taken more than I should have. Colum Boyle.
Yep, thank you. Just a couple of very wee quick ones before we go into my more substantive ones. In relation to the Chair's question, Grainia, around why are we extrapolating the numbers of children when we could just simply be, or people, we could just simply be counting them and recording them with another click or two?
So we do. So we'll furnish you after this meeting with the number of people as well as the number of households, and we can give you the reason we need to be careful we don't double count really is the reason, because there will be some people who have some family where children live across 2 households. So that, I suppose that was the point I was making. I suppose the other thing just to mention, and I think this is really important, because I know there are people watching this today from across the voluntary community sector who will hope that the conclusion we don't come to in policy terms is that this is too difficult and that the numbers are so big that we need something transformational in a legislative sense which will lead to less protection. And I suppose I will take my guidance from elsewhere in that as the head of the housing executive. But Northern Ireland has a more generous and a wider definition of homelessness than other jurisdictions. And so that is not in any way to move us away from the numbers, because housing is about people and it's about numbers. But our definition is broader, and we haven't resided in that. And there's nothing that I have seen in the last few years that would make me think we should. But I think it's important to say that, and also the fact that our obligation to a household that is homeless and is a full duty applicant household is to provide them with temporary accommodation until we can provide them with essentially a social housing tenancy. So that means when somebody enters temporary accommodation, they are likely to be there for some considerable time. And in fact, the average now is over 600 days. So that's 2 years in which a family will stay in temporary accommodation until we can provide them with a social housing tenancy. Now we are looking at, and we will maybe come on to the point around in the future how we can discharge into other tenures provided protections are there. But I think to that point, part of the reason the numbers are the way they are in terms of the numbers of people who are homeless and the numbers of households who are homeless is because our definition of homelessness is broad. That is a good thing that protects people, and I think that's an important point to make, if you don't mind, Chair.
Okay. Another quick on this one occurred to me as you were speaking, Colum, in relation to the crisis and the emergency that you referenced there. In light of that, how can we account for the fact that 3,200 homes have been sold by the Housing Executive since 2017? That's the equivalent of 30% of new starts. So why has the Minister set his face against taking a moratorium or ending the right to buy at the present time, given that other jurisdictions have done that? I believe the Housing Executive have expressed their concern around that. So basically for every 100 new starts, we're losing 30% of them out the other side and right to buy. Why is the Minister taking that approach?
I understand. I know you've had this conversation with Minister before, so and I know he has given you his view. So we give Minister a range of advice on these things, and he has his perspective and makes his mind up on that. So his view of it is he wants to make sure that other options are available to increase the options for people to actually have new homes, and that's what he's been trying to do in terms of affordable housing, in terms of trying to boost the numbers for social housing, in terms of trying to have that engagement through DOF with Treasury about borrowing powers for the Housing Executive, so some more money is available both to look after the existing asset and build more. So Minister's been very, very active across the piece. He has not gone down the road that you've asked about. He has his own particular reasons for doing that. You might want to add something to that, Paul. You've been involved in some of those discussions as well.
Yeah, and in the last 10 years we have built 9,000 new social homes, and I mean some years back we did manage to remove the right to buy scheme for housing association properties.
I've taken that into account.
The housing executive is the one that remains. We have tested the executive appetite to do something about that. It wasn't met. We have tested the executive's appetite to do something about that under Minister Hagi. They didn't want to. It will take primary legislation. It means in the meantime you can edit or amend the scheme, and that is always under review, i.e. for certain types of properties where there is a more compelling case to keep them in social supply.
And is there work ongoing? Because that's quite urgent, given we're in the middle of the crisis. That can't wait to, we would hope things would get better before some of that work.
Yes, it is, but it's editing the scheme. It's using the power to amend the scheme rather than addressing, which you would have to do through primary legislation, the continuation of the scheme really on its current numbers.
So are we expecting an announcement around the editing of the scheme?
I'm not sure that it's subject to minister, so there will be no dates for that. But it is always under review whether you take certain properties out of the scheme.
Okay, thank you. It's a key one, and I will come back to it. I'm sure in due course. But anyway, so Grainia, this one's back to yourself. Given the importance, and it's the first objective of the homelessness strategy, and we really do need to be getting upstream to prevent people from falling into homelessness, rather than, as you have said, the urgent need to secure accommodation to meet the need versus the urgency to prevent the need. So why have you not been able to prioritise greater funding to prevent homelessness?
Yes, well, so as I say, it is the priority in the strategy. It is something we are deeply committed to, and every spare penny we could have spent in the homelessness budget over the last few years we have put towards prevention. There is 3 types of prevention, and there's primary, there's secondary and tertiary prevention, and of course primary prevention is universal. And so, for example, we've been able to, through some of our funding, fund organisations like Housing Rights to provide their online advice service. That's open to everyone, so that's the kind of universal element of prevention. Secondary prevention then is focused on key groups, and again, at every stage in our process that we've been, or in our annual funding year, we have funded through our community support and prevention funding. And we have supported funded Welcome Organisation, funded a number of organisations to provide outreach service, Welcome Provide Outreach, for example. And then the tertiary prevention is focused on key groups. And I think one of the programmes that we're probably all most proud of is Complex Lives, which is well known, which is a person-centred approach to chronic homelessness. All of those programmes have been monitored in terms of their outcomes. We know what works, and we would love to scale up, and I would personally love to scale up Complex Lives, not just in Belfast but across Northern Ireland, because chronic homelessness is a really, really significant issue. Most fundamentally, we've not been able to do that because the funding hasn't been available, and so the funding hasn't been available because we have been collectively putting that funding into accommodation. And it is as simple as that. It's not unique to Northern Ireland. It is something that every jurisdiction, and including across Europe, are looking at this. How do you get the balance right between the urgent versus the important? And it is probably beyond just homelessness from a public policy point of view. An answer to it, would a statutory duty on prevention, in terms of putting a statutory duty on the right to assistance, would that help? And I don't mean accommodation-based assistance, I mean wider assistance. Would that help? That's what some other jurisdictions have done, and we can learn lessons, positive and negative, from that.
Yeah, and you lead me nicely on to my next question, which is for yourself, Colum. And currently we're spending about 5.5 million out of a total budget of 75.3. I think about 36 million is going into temporary, but 5.5 million is what we're spending. You have made additional requests for additional funding, and that's been declined by the department. You'd think an additional amount on the top of that 5.5 could have a big impact. Why have the department declined that bid for additional preventative funding?
Okay. The extra money would make a difference. We accept that, absolutely. So, bottom line of this is we don't have enough money. I'll give you a little bit of an insight to that, just in terms of the figures. Between 2022-23 up to 25-26, we increased the Housing Executive's homelessness budget, their urban and resource budget, from 21.6 million to 37 million. That was a 71% increase in that time. Now, when you're under the hammer, and we were under the hammer in terms of trying to cope with the crisis, as I talked about earlier on, the choice between engaging in some extra money for prevention and actually putting in place some extra money to meet the statutory obligation to provide temporary accommodation, it's a no-brainer, I'm sorry. We had to actually meet the demand right here, right now. Totally get the prevention thing, absolutely no issue with it. It's not statutory, and that's our first obligation, is to meet the statutory piece.
I get that, Colin, but I suppose people are looking at the department, a big department responsible for a lot of things, and making a lot of spending announcements on very many issues. And it would seem that this is one that really would benefit and really would generate savings and, maybe more importantly, make a real impact on people's lives. And some people find it difficult to rationalise why there can't be more money found within the department, given some of the things that have been. I
mean, I can deal with that, right? The report specifically says that strategic prevention was not properly prioritised in 23-24, and the lengths we had to go to fund in the department to fund essentially the requirement for temporary accommodation. Yes, they included on that list strategic prevention, but elsewhere on that list you find things like an inflationary uplift for the Providers of Supporting People programme. You find the funding of the starter packs, that people who get placed in temporary accommodation, the little bundle of household items they need to make their temporary accommodation successful, those were taken out. So we were in a context where I think my problem with that particular point in the report is the option of funding strategic prevention was simply not available, to the extent that all these other things also were not available. It was that important.
I get the ratio. I get the difference between within the housing allocation the need to do more, but like, for example, there's $250,000 has been allocated to Ulster to America celebrating the 250th. So in terms of priorities within the department wider, would that $250,000 not make, or money like that, not make a serious impact?
I think so. There is headroom available in 25-26 that there was not available in 23-24, and that has helped. It is helpful that homelessness prevention is now prioritised in the programme for government. It is helpful there is a minister who can follow up on that priority and ring fence the protection. But I think that the prior to that, in previous years, particularly under the hugely volatile demand for temporary accommodation, we were always having to anticipate its increase. There was no option available of ring-fencing strategic prevention.
But to answer your question, our Minister has a range of strategic priorities. He has a set of ministerial priorities which he's been very, very clear about with us. He gets the importance of all of these things, and actually he's the first Minister. I mean, if you look back to 2017, from 2017 to 2020, we had no Minister in place. From 2020 to 2022, we sat in the middle of COVID when we had ministers back. Then from 2022, the next couple of years, we had no ministers again. And none of these decisions were actually, there was nobody there to take them. We had to take them during that period of time, and that's what my colleague's referring to. So now we have a minister who's making priority decisions. He has put money into homelessness prevention. He has continued to safeguard the money that's there in terms of supporting people. In fairness, he has done that. I get the point that you're making in terms of the other priorities you're saying. Are they as valuable to society as this? That's a question you can ask any minister. That's a question you need to ask a minister directly. I can't get inside his head to give you the specific answer on that, but he has a portfolio of things that he will need to do and wishes to do, and that's part of his mandate to do that.
Okay, thank you, and I'm sure I will get, as Chair of Communities, I will once again be following that up, so thank you. Finally from me then, just quickly, if you can, just give a brief answer. Could the increase in demand for homelessness services and the pressure on service providers have been avoided by a more sustained focus on early intervention and prevention?
Brilliant question. I mean, fundamentally, yes. The earlier you can put money into prevention, you see the impact straight away. But, I don't think, with the exception of the second shock, we could have prevented certainly the first. It was pandemic related. Now, I spend a lot of time thinking, what if? So when I came into the organisation, I took on the role in April 2021. I was very surprised by the lack of contingency accommodation. I think that we had 36 units. I remember one of my colleagues telling me. So I don't think at the time we were well prepared enough for a shock of that size. But to go from 3,000 placements a year to 9.5, then 10, then 11, nobody could ever have been prepared for that. And I don't think any public purse would have allowed us to have contingency of that level. So I think the lesson that I think we should all learn is, which we are putting in place now, is have a steady, easy to access supply of temporary accommodation, because economic cycles happen. and shocks happen, and we didn't have it at the time. But on top of that, always have prevention as a core part of how we provide public services and housing. And I think there's a lesson for everybody in that. And I don't just mean Northern Ireland. I talk to housing professionals all over these islands, and we're all applying those lessons. Ironically, we are applying the same lessons that some of us were learning 20 years ago, those of us who are starting to get old doing these types of jobs. You know, they happen in cycles. And, you know, we taking our eye off the prevention ball, I think we are now paying for now. But as I say, that is beyond any of us in this room, I think. But if we can start to make structural and permanent changes to our housing system now, hopefully who's sitting in this chair in 20 years' time won't be saying the same things.
But you also made the point as well about the perfect storm, about what was happening in the private rented sector as well, about the capacity of that dropping and about the cost of rent in the private rented sector going up as well. So there's a lot of factors to this that I think we're going to make any prevention strategy seriously tested to try and cope with the level of demand that was placed here. I don't think it would have met it. I really don't think it would have met it. And I know those are the conversations that we had.
Yes, and so one of the things we've been able to do as a landlord, so we've talked today mostly about the Housing Executive as the strategic housing authority, but we're also a landlord of 83,000 homes, and so we dialed up our two things: our tenancy sustainment, because we couldn't have a situation whereby we were losing our own tenants from our own properties and adding to the homelessness demand. So we dialed that up, and we also dialed up our financial inclusion work, and we were able to do that through our rental income. And so I suppose the other thing I would say is, one of the things I'm proud of is we pulled every possible lever available to us, and we've applied some of that learning. So we now know the impact of financial inclusion. We know how much you need to put in to see the impacts of that, and I think that's been very, very helpful. But you know, to come back to those three aspects of prevention, you must have universal prevention in your public services. And Colum's absolutely right. To see it now in the programme for government, a mindset shift, that we don't take our eye off that and we continue to fund it, I think that will really serve us well in the next few years.
Thank you, Colum. Thanks, Grainia. Okay, our Deputy Chair, Diane Forsyth.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you both for being here. And where we have strayed slightly into the political sphere, I feel that it's important to say that I think that Minister Lyons has shown his commitment to addressing homelessness head on very strongly. He's been very clear in his message, and he's made it very clear his target to build more social homes, and if he had more budget he would be doing that. And as you say,
I've said.
Yep, absolutely. And his commitment to securing the supporting people budget and the prevention element of that as well. But just getting back to the focus of us here in this committee, looking at this report and the questions to you as officials, I just want to speak a wee bit to the outcome measurement of this. And previous reports that we've had here have been quite cross-cutting in terms of outcomes, and you've mentioned some of them here today as well. We've had mental health, reducing adult reoffending, access to education and employment and benefits. So all of those things are so cross-cutting, and this links, you know, quite closely into those. So where you're spending money on preventing homelessness, it actually affects all of those different departments, and it's really difficult but important to capture. So I just want to ask, why has the homelessness prevention outcome measurement taken so long?
I think there's a number. Sorry, well, so I think there's a number of helpful elements of the report in relation to sending us in a good direction on this. But I suppose the first thing I would say is the homelessness strategy is really unique. I haven't seen a strategy developed quite like it. It was developed in a genuinely inclusive way. It was endorsed by the Central Homelessness Forum, which is not just made up of the Housing Executive, though we chair it, and it's one of the key structures. It's made up of colleagues from the department. It's made up of colleagues from across the voluntary and community sector. And so we jointly signed up to a strategy which Homeless Connect, there's some really, really helpful language from Homeless Connect in demonstrating the inclusive nature of the strategy, and they strongly support it. And so when we put the strategy together, we agreed strategic objectives, a set of actions which we publish annually, and then alongside that there are indicators and outcomes, and those indicators should measure the extent to which we get to those outcomes, but they are very long-term outcomes. Okay, so they are things like the numbers of people in the homelessness system, so the numbers of people presenting, the numbers of placements and temporary accommodation, and so they're very long-term outcomes. When we put the documents together, we were clear, first of all, and I remember jointly signing the forward with the chair at the time, and we said in it, many things can happen in the life of this strategy. We don't know what they are yet, and so therefore we will have annual action plans, and they will be annual, because from time to time we may need to change course, and as I've said, we then had to shift from prevention into that, I suppose, delivering accommodation on a much greater level, and that had an impact. And we were also clear in writing the strategy that some of the baselines, to answer your question, in terms of outcomes wouldn't be in place from day one. And so those two particular areas, baselines in relation to chronic homelessness and baseline data in relation to prevention, we said it would take us some time, which it has done, and the report sets that out. So I suppose that's the first reason. It is a strategy that's dynamic. There are annual action plans. We set the indicators over time, or some of the baseline data and some of those indicators over time. But when I look back also, and I look at the way in which the report treats and focuses on outcomes and how we measure outcomes, I suppose, to be frank, we could have made our lives easier if we'd picked outcomes that were much simpler. I don't think the Central Homelessness Forum would have signed off on that. So our outcomes are ambitious. Our outcomes said we will reduce the numbers of people who are presenting as homeless. We've only just got there. And I have to say to this committee, and I've said to you already, Colum, that may change next month or the month after that, because we don't know the extent to which demand is going to come at us. Again, the rest of the outcomes they are highly ambitious outcomes. So to get the strategy agreed, it was entirely appropriate that we have long-term high-level outcomes. The NIAO has understandably said we have not achieved those outcomes, but I think my view would be the nature of those outcomes they are very, very long term, and I don't think there are jurisdictions anywhere on these islands that are meeting those. So I think there's some lesson for us. Should we have outcomes that are a little bit closer in terms of not so long term, not so fundamental, maybe, and I think we have to now go away and have a think about that. But what I don't want to do, and I think the Homelessness Forum would not allow us to do this, is to be less ambitious. And that's the challenge. And I think the audit report is helpful. We need to go away. We need to do some thinking now about how and we've set it out in our response, in how we make the distinction between our objectives, those action plans, and how we ensure that those outcomes are as linked as possible, and maybe pull them a little bit closer and a little bit more closely to reality, without undermining our ambition.
Sorry, thanks, Grainia. It's the second time now the Audit Office has recommended better outcomes data and measurement for homelessness services, having reported on this back as far as 2017. And as we talk about investment and reducing the investment of it, do you think that by failing to measure these outcomes, we can't actually prove what is working?
We haven't failed to measure the outcomes. I think what the Audit Office has said is that we haven't achieved on those outcomes. And again, like I said, the numbers always speak for themselves in housing. So I think what we now need to do is we need to be clearer in the outcomes and maybe bring them closer to where we are today, not so far away in terms of their achievement. But I also think that, and I think the point you're referring to is the smartness of some of our actions. I'm very, very clear. So where I disagree with the report is that it suggests that the actions that we've set aren't aligned to the objectives. I think they are, and I think we've set out pretty clearly that they are, and they're public documents. We have annual action plans and we have progress reports, and they're public, and I'm very content with them. But I do accept the point. If there's confusion, and if the Audit Office find it difficult to work their way through the various different actions, progress reports, indicators and outcomes, clearly we need to sharpen that up and we need to make that smarter. And so again, we've set out in our response to this report how we will do that. We've put a series of measures in place, and we will have that done by certainly by the end of this financial year. So I'm very, very happy. If it's not clear to people where we're making progress, then it's in our interest to make sure that we are clear about that. So
from our point of view, there's major value in the recommendation. And the space is too cluttered. There are too many groups looking at different aspects that overlap. In terms of reference, I think could be clearer in some of them. I think some of this has been in place before we had the shocks that Grainia referred to. We're in a different world with homelessness here. There needs to be greater simplicity, greater crispness, greater be able to track it, greater longitudinal tracking, bringing it right back to the individual in a way which is doable from a data perspective. We've had a very clear discussion around the PermSec table on this as well. We see justice playing very strongly into this already. They have been for some time. Health coming to it, and coming to it very boldly now, which I'm pleased to see. Education, good on the ground, but strategically not as good as it needs to be, and I've had that discussion with Ronnie as well. So there are changes that need to be made to this, and we need to change ourselves, actually. Because I think we need to bring extra value to this to make this a lot more digestible. So the very point you're making, if the audit officer saying to us, what's going on in the middle of all of this, and we're getting a lot of noise, we're not getting actual traction on what the situation actually is, then nobody's gaining from it. So we need to bring greater clarity, greater focus, and greater ability to actually test outcomes, whether they be short or longer term.
Absolutely, and I think you capture it well. I also chair the all-party group on the voluntary and community sector, and I know from speaking to them that whenever they're getting funding, a lot of the time the funding towards certain services, they're doing a little bit of prevention on the side, and as you say, you're not pulling out that little bit, you're not measuring it, and there's actually a lot of things that as a department and as the housing executive you're putting money into that is feeding into that, but you're not able to capture the outcome because there's just strands of it everywhere. I think that's what you're saying.
So for example, young people leaving care, yourselves, justice, health, working with yourselves, working very closely together, that's one of the pieces, that's a nugget that says to me, we need to replicate this and do it in a different way. That's where we need to be.
I think, apologies, sorry. Yeah, we also have, I think, learned a lot from what we need in terms of better systems, okay? And so since 22-23, we've had in place an agreed definition of what a prevention intervention looks like. And that's been quite transformational, actually. So that's something that we've put in place within the housing executive and our housing advisory teams and so on, and our homelessness team. But we agreed that in partnership with the voluntary community sector. So we now have an agreed definition of what a prevention looks like between us and the partners that we fund. So that means no matter who you are, if somebody is intervening and making a decision and enabling you through that action to prevent your homelessness, we now track that, we count it, we now have 2 years of data, and that I think will be really, really helpful, because first of all it will show what works, it will show the impact, it will show the aggregate impact of all of that work, but it will also make it far, far easier for us to make the case for additional funding, and I think that's the bit, and I think that's been very, very helpful. So we are further ahead quite quickly than when the audit office came and put the report together, and I look forward to being able to report on that progress, because we have made significant progress very, very quickly. I would say that partnership with the voluntary community sector is very important, and I think that the strategy was really lauded by the sector as a genuinely inclusive strategy. So I think getting that balance between the reality of what we're going to do today and what we ultimately where we want to get to in that ambition, I think will probably continue to be a bit of a natural but a healthy tension.
No, absolutely, and you mentioned it as well, Grainia, but it's one of the success stories highlighted in the Audit Office report was the Complex Lives initiative, and had a couple of detailed presentations on that. It's just such an impressive project with really clear to follow numbers, where you can see that by working together, all of those different agencies alongside the local council have been able to make such a difference to people's lives. And I suppose sometimes it feels crude to translate it so directly into numbers, because actually really transform somebody's lives and their outcomes. But come back to sort of the theme of my previous question, where you're trying to say we need to spend more money in this, but we need to trace what the actual value is coming out the other side. But on the Complex Lives initiative, they were able to quantify it to a degree, and one of the big hurdles was data sharing in that, and it's my understanding that worked quite well there. So I just wanted to ask, how did you overcome the data sharing hurdle in that, and what sort of time frame did it take to reach there?
So yes, the data share, and colleagues in the voluntary sector watching this, we were all smiling at the same time. So the data sharing hurdle nearly killed us all, if I'm frank, because it took us so long to get legal advice that allowed us to do it. We sat in a room, and I think eventually we all just agreed, we have to crack this, and it did take far too long. But it was worth it when we got there. And so, and I think it was probably the one area where we can now say as public officials to others who are trying to share, Complex Lives is unique for a lot of reasons, but it's also unique because it's a co-funded project. So it is genuinely public bodies, and the Housing Executive is the largest funder of Complex Lives, but we don't feel the need to chair the group. The group is chaired by Belfast City Council, and I think that's genuine sharing, because often when you're the biggest funder you want to wade in there and you want to be in charge of everything, and actually we've said no, we're going to put the money in because it's going in the right thing, it's going in the right place, and it is a group of strategic leaders sitting around a table who have taken risks on this. But I think we can now share that, and we have already shared some of that practice with other voluntary or with other public bodies, because data sharing, we got there through I suppose, tenacity in agreeing that it was going to happen no matter what. And every time we got advice that said you can't do it, we said, well, why not? Tell us why not? What needs to change? What can we change? How can we better as organisations? So it was quite a bit of risk taking, I think, on the part of public officials, I think.
It's a good example of how, you know, taking those chances and cutting across the different silos in government, you can, you know, make a difference to people's lives. And I know that particular project was, you know, Belfast City Council, because this, you know, city has very particular issues. And whenever I was hearing more about it, I was trying to think, you know, it's difficult to see how it would translate to like my area of South Down being a lot more rural, but definitely a lot of lessons to be learned. And as you say, you've shared some of the aspects with that, with the data sharing with other bodies. Are you planning to, or could you formally do that? Because again, it's something that's come through in a theme in a lot of our reports about how a lot of good recommendations would be different bodies and different departments actually sharing things with each other.
Yes, very much so. In fact, there was I think it was the NICON conference, I can follow up with more detail on this, where there were a number of I suppose innovations across the public sector, and colleagues from Belfast City Council and ourselves and a number of partners around the table have presented. So we have certainly been very happy to present to other public bodies on, you know, I suppose how we crack the data sharing piece. I suppose just on that point, and I think this is something that we've talked about a lot as public servants, is how you take risks and how you do things that are difficult. And one of them for us was genuinely setting that target on children in hotels and bed and breakfast accommodation, because there was no law requiring us to do it, there was no policy requiring us to do it, there was no ministerial direction required or priority requiring us to do it. And so we set the KPI in our business plan. And I remember our previous Director of Housing before he retired saying to me, you're going to be in a PAC someday and you're going to not hit that target, and they're going to say, why didn't you hit the target? And I said, well, it's the right thing to do. And here we are in a PAC, and even though the Audit Office report says we haven't met it, since then we have met it, but even if we hadn't met it, it was still the right thing to do. Because what did it do? It changed the culture within our organisations, where everybody agreed we're not going to place children in hotel and bed and breakfast accommodation. If I had that as some target that the Chief Exec set, but it wasn't written somewhere, we wouldn't have done it. It had to come up to our Audit and Risk Committee, it had to come to our board, it had to go to the department, and we're now at the point where we're meeting it. We might not meet it next month. It might be read next month because it's demand-led service. But I think there's something for all of us to learn around how do we allow public servants to take risks, do the right thing. But when you get a red against a KPI, you know, sometimes that's okay if it drives the right culture in your organisation.
The other thing just to say is place-based interventions is a fantastic way to go to try and do these things and try them out and get all the organisations there and get the data share working out and really focus in holistically on a particular place. And you've seen that example, and that works really, really well. So it's been able to do more of that. So you have exemplars dotted throughout the province here, so you're able to actually drive that out. That's a key piece of where we want to be with this.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, Cahill.
Thank you very much, Chair, and you're very welcome. And Catherine, you're not forgotten, or you haven't spoken over there, but
okay.
you're still with us. And listen, it's been a good conversation, and thanks very much for the open and robust and frankness with the responses. And I mean, just a couple of open remarks because I'm mindful of what the committee is and what we're trying to do, but it's hard not to put on your statutory committee hat at times. And Colum, you're right, but you know, there has to be learned from COVID as well. You know, besides all the things you've said, it's been a challenging time right across the board. But the interesting thing you said to me, and I know we keep talking about budgets and funding, but we still have a responsibility and we still have departments to run, we've still all jobs to do, right? So from that point of view, we have done a number of reports on this committee, and the general conversation is about departments and operating in silos, so it's no secret. But I'm taking some encouragement from yourself in terms of what you're saying when you're meeting as permanent secretaries. I'm not saying that the silo mentality, so I'm not asking you to respond to that, but there seems to be a wee bit more positivity in terms of our working relationship. Is that?
Yeah, the PermSec group is a really good group, and there's a desire to collaborate very strongly. So each PermSec has got the minister that's set up as an individual department, individual ministry, and you know, things like homelessness, for example, where we need to work across the boundaries. I'm seeing a different dialogue over the last year or so, which is open to this. Mike Farrar has come in from GB. He's so open to trying new things. He's bringing experience of what he's done elsewhere that's worked. This place-based stuff that I was talking about earlier, he wants to see a lot more of that done. So he's saying, hands up, he's saying, look, I don't think, we've been focused in on the things that health need to focus in from a statutory point of view. And I think what you're asking us to do is find some resource to be able to reach out and do other things. And they're doing that, actually. And he's got Chief Medical Officer involved and doing a bit of restructuring internally to help do some of the stuff with us on homelessness that would be really, really beneficial. And that, for me, is opening a great new door for us. So I think that's the start of it. And I think permanent secretaries, they get together every Friday morning. We have a meeting every Friday for 2 or 3 hours. You get a lot of business done, and you get a lot of collaboration, and you get a lot of really good development around certain things that you want to do. And that's a very, very positive thing for us. And I take my hat off to Jane Brady for she's catalysed that, she's made that happen.
Well, and I asked in the context because at the end of this report, we'll bring a number of recommendations and they'll go to whoever's responsibility it is. And you've heard, we've listened as part of the question here from the members, who's taking responsibility for what. And it is a bit of responsibility. But back, and I'll come to my 2 questions in a minute, but back to it, collectively, it was responsibility in all of us. Yep. And that's where we need to be with this. And, Diane's right, although fair play there, the member always gets South Down, we mentioned, and all the committees in fair play there, but, in terms of what we're trying to do, bring it back to where we're at with this here, and it's important we get as much information informed as we can to move forward. So I'll go to questions. Grainia, you mentioned about the 2.7 million allocation for the strategic prevention. Can you detail exactly what that is for? And have you a robust mechanism or framework designed to measure its impact?
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Catherine, I called you out at the start, fair play.
I knew it was coming there. I'll answer the first part of that question,
that's okay,
certainly. So we get 2.7 million for strategic prevention this year. 200,000 of that was for new foundations, which you'll be aware of, which is centred around young people leaving care. That also funds the Complex Lives work that we've already talked about. Housing First is another model that has had some success as well. So it funds that. It also funds, Grainia mentioned earlier, some of the financial inclusion work. It funds that. We have a custodial housing pilot that fund would give to as well. And we have a prevention fund for which organisations can apply. They will outline their proposals to deliver prevention measures. Those will be assessed and then a decision made on what funding each of those proposals will get based on what they're going to deliver. So I know it's maybe a relatively small amount of money, however there are really key projects in there. In terms of outcomes?
Yes, I can touch on that. And I suppose the difference between how we're spending that strategic prevention programme this time round and the previous time, I think, has very much been driven by evidence, not just from what's worked in Northern Ireland, but beyond that. So what Catherine has listed there is a very, very targeted set of interventions. So what we've learned, for example, from Complex Lives is the need for intervention for people who are chronically homeless. And in particular, there's a group of women who have been, that awful phrase, in the system for a long time. We now know the interventions that help, and therefore we want to fund that specifically. We also know domestic violence needs a lot of focus, new foundations, so young people ageing out of the care system. So I think in the past, the strategic prevention money would have been more generic. It is much more targeted, much more specific now, and I think that's a really good thing, and it allows us to measure that. In terms of the second half of your question, the outcomes, that's where that definition of prevention that I talked about earlier on, the fact that we've now got that agreed, and that's underway now for the last couple of years. All of those providers, everybody who's providing those services must submit returns, as they always will do, to us, must submit evidence and data to us. We then pull that together, and I suppose the difference then is we're developing a system for pulling that together in an aggregate basis. That will be ready by June of next year, and that's in the action plan which we've submitted in our response to the Audit Office report, and that will give us a platform, so an ICT platform through which we can gather that information, but it gives us the same set of data measured in the same way for all all of those interventions. So we'll be able to say, okay, that worked, that didn't work as well, that worked, we need to dial that up. And I think, again, that allows us to know where can we extract as much value for public money.
Thank you. Just and then follows on nicely, because I mean, clearly it's a pot of money. It has to be spent by 26. It seems to be rather a short term. You know, I know it said strategic prevention, and there's a lot of learning. And but from the department's point of view, what are the plans for the department to invest in prevention initiatives which merit longer term support?
Okay, so I'll bring Paul on in a second, but just to say, Grainia doesn't have to come through me to get to the Minister. Grainia and the housing professionals that we have inside the department meet the Minister very, very regularly on housing. So Minister wants to understand what's happening on the ground with housing and housing prevention and homelessness and all of the rest of that. And he gets all of that directly from you, and we give him advice and all the rest of that. In terms of going forward, pitching for the next 3 years for the budgets going forward. I said earlier on, Ministers, the first time we've really had a proper budget set down. It was relatively small, but I think it's been well used, and I think there's a level of piloting in and around that. So I think that ongoing dialogue that we're having with the Housing Executive in terms of the evidence of the proof of how that works and being able to focus that, I think you're making a really, really good case here. And I think, you know, there should be, we're very, very positive here about funding this going forward. So this isn't just a, let's see how this goes. We know from speaking to housing professionals that homelessness prevention works, but we want to make sure we get the right blend of homelessness prevention, and that we're backing the right winners. And if that works better, who knows? We could make more money available depending on how the budgetary process runs for us.
Yeah, in short, everything Grainia has said is going to put us in a place to make stronger bids for increased homelessness prevention funding. The only dimension I'd add to what Colum has said is that that argument will always be competing with the funding that is compelled by the statutory duty as we currently have it. So what we perhaps also need to do, subject to Minister, is have that conversation about whether we also need to give ourselves a statutory duty to fund prevention that competes with the current statutory duty to fund temporary accommodation.
Well, I do agree, and Colum, I agree. I'll finish on this point because it's interesting, because we're talking about, because we're about value for money and challenge. I mean, smaller amounts of money may be able to do greater things.
Absolutely.
And that's about working in partnership. And if we don't get it right, even across departments, I can't argue a minister's own autonomy to do whatever he or she, but that's where we're at with it. I just want to pick on one point that Colum asked the question earlier on, in the right to buy. And obviously, and I'm not going to get into the arguments of the individual's rights either, with the right. Is that part of the issue in terms of changing, or can you comment on that? An individual's right to buy, is that part of the conversation? Because we are talking from a stock point of view, on lower stocks. You know, we said it's come from a different angle, but I just threw it out there as part of the argument. Cause
well, the facts are, in any typical year, the housing executive will sell off between 300 or 400 homes.
400, closer to 400.
So it is having that material effect on supply every year. Now, in every typical year, we will also then complete around about 1,600 homes, new social homes, housing association homes. But so there is the constant netting effect on supply, on new supply of sales. That's a fact. Is that answering your question? Those are the facts of the issue.
We know that. I know that side. I'm coming at from the individual's right to buy the house. The individual, they're entitled. Is that part of the conversation?
I think there's a belief in that, right?
You know what I mean?
There's a fundamental belief in that, right?
There's
no doubt.
Yes,
that's
part of it. I think that's the two sides of the debate. There those against who make a supply side argument.
I think that's my assessment of that position. Yeah, I would.
Sorry, Chair, slightly straight out, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Cathal. Okay, we'll go to Stephen Dunn.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, folks, for your detailed presentation so far and answers. Just going back to temporary accommodation, which obviously is quite a significant issue, and we appreciate the demand has soared since COVID, that has been outlined, but some of the figures are truly staggering, I think it's fair to say. £8 million in 18-19 and now over £40 million in a period of six, 7 years is quite a significant amount, even with the increase in cost of living and inflation in that period. It is certainly a very high percentage. So I suppose we're keen to see what is being done to reduce the reliance and expenditure on this non-standard accommodation through hotels and B&Bs and so on, which is spiralling, and as I say, is staggering figures coming out of the bills for that.
We spoke earlier about the executive having a strategy with this is starting to crest now a wee bit, so we're starting to get a grip here. So you want to just describe?
Yes, thank you. So again, just for context, so we have certainly seen a significant growth in temporary accommodation use in Northern Ireland. It is proportionally lower than other UK regions, so it's roughly equivalent to 270 households per 100,000 population. That's broadly in line with Scotland, and it's below English local authorities as well as the big cities. So they are staggering numbers. I absolutely agree. They're also shocking. I mean, just to say, I wouldn't want anyone to think we're not always, as housing professionals, shocked by that. Non-standard accommodation, so hotel and bed and breakfast accommodation, currently make up between 9 and 10% of overall temporary accommodation, but they are in expense terms, they can be as much as 6.5 or 7 times more expensive, as you can imagine, a hotel room per night than temporary accommodation, so than single let. So what we've done up to now has been to increase the amount in terms of our overall portfolio. We want as much single let accommodation, because when you have a stable supply of single let accommodation, particularly accommodation whereby we've block booked it, we've negotiated a fixed rate, and that is stable over a period of time. But we also, where we have leases that go beyond 12 months, they're capitalised. So again, that gives us more of a mixed economy in terms of we need some capital funding, we need some revenue. From a finance point of view, that certainly helps us in terms of long-term investment. So all of our work to date has been on ensuring that we are ahead of the curve in having a stable and a steady supply of temporary accommodation from a value for money point of view. As Colum says, we've now arrived at a point where I suppose the financial envelope is beginning to stabilise. It's less volatile than it was, and we can come on to that. Where we go from here, one of the really, really important aspects of this is the fact that the Housing Executive has now had departmental approval to acquire temporary accommodation. And I mentioned earlier on, I suppose, that I was taken aback when I joined the organisation that we didn't have the Housing Executive as a landlord, and the Strategic Housing Authority didn't have its own supply of accommodation that it would retain as temporary accommodation. We have had approval to acquire 600 homes. The intention would be those homes would be acquired by the Housing Executive over the next 3 years, 100 next year, then 200, then 300. They are for temporary accommodation use, and we would expect that to be the case over the medium term. What's extraordinary about that is the fact that we will acquire those properties from our own reserve, so that is our rental income reserve. And so I suppose that shows the extent to which we're taking this issue seriously. We're very pleased that the department has agreed for us to do that, and so that will be 600 homes that we will retain then as temporary accommodation, and that is a very, very important aspect from our point of view of, to answer your question, reducing our reliance on volatile forms of temporary accommodation and having a much more stable. So that is a very, very important next step for us.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry to come in, I just want to come in there, and that will save significant amounts of money over the next few years. I mean, I think some of the criticisms about governance in the report are really valuable and fair, but the department's oversight of the Housing Executive in recent years has been particularly directed at this particular question. How can we get control, a greater control on the spend? How can we increase reliance on the less expensive forms of accommodation and reduce reliance on the more expensive forms of accommodation? And there has been real success in this area, and we've gone through every penny spent by the Housing Executive in order to assure ourselves of this point. So the spend, certainly the net spend, is cresting. That's the point. I mean, so the numbers are going up. For the people's story, we still need to keep really working at. But the actual sort of budgetary management, the quality of that is improving all the time, even while the numbers increase.
Yeah. No, well, that's good. Certainly, just on the value for money framework on the temporary accommodation, is that now in place?
Yes, it is. Yeah, in fact, and so again, just for others to, I mean, this is a piece of work that we ourselves commissioned from the Centre for Homelessness Impact, and that's a What Works centre which works across the UK and comes in and essentially takes a look at a key area of public service and looks at ways in which we can increase value for money. We've always been very impressed with them as an organisation, so we asked them to come in and they mapped across all of our processes and systems in terms of onboarding, temporary accommodation, what we spend, how we spend it, the data and so on, and they came up with a number of recommendations to enable us to improve our value for money and our approach, and there's a number of ways in which we've done that. We've actually just also within that improved, because the Audit Office report was helpful in terms of asking us to formalise some of our procedures in terms of how we bring on and apply our controls on non-standard, so hotel accommodation. So we've now put that in place, and that was approved last month, so we're ahead on that. And so we're ahead of our own action plan, both in terms of that and the action plan on temporary accommodation. And I suppose the measure of that is looking at, so I'm just looking at some of the numbers. We've gone from, in 18 months, not using any HMOs, so houses of multiple occupation, to now having more than 100 HMOs. So in the market in which it is in, and with the budget in which we have, to be able to go from a standing start to now having a steady supply of houses of multiple occupation, and we're almost up at 120, I believe. 125 HMOs is our current portfolio. That will give us real stability. That is 125 hotel rooms that we're not using. So that's that point that Catherine keeps reminding me about. Here's the efficiency that we now have baked into the system. Last year we brought on an additional 361 units of single lets. This year to date, in the first 6 months, we've secured 352. So every year we do this, we're getting better. We've got, as I say, more of a sense of what's out there in the market. But I have to also say, I didn't really ever think I'd see the day that the Housing Executive would need a portfolio of 5,000 units. We're the Strategic Housing Authority and the public landlord. So I now have a team of people who understand the private rented market, who are out there negotiating with landlords, who are applying the controls that Catherine applies. We report that up through our Audit and Risk Board. That is a whole new area of work that we've had to now put in place. Absolutely, in the last number of years, rent collection, all of that aspect of it. But look, that's what other public authorities are doing. That's what others. We talk to all of our peers across the other jurisdictions. So absolutely right and proper that both the department and our board, our audit committee, and of course the NIAO want to look at the controls that we've applied. So the report's been very helpful.
Yeah. Can I just add one more thing there, because I've made this point already, but I want to make it again, and because the Housing Executive won't make it themselves. Unlike many of these other authorities in Scotland and England, for example, the Housing Executive has met its statutory obligations while living within its means. There are oodles and oodles of examples across England, London and elsewhere, and in Scotland, where that has not happened. And I think you're talking about value for money. The impact of what you've done, whilst the cost is extremely high, eye-watering and all the rest, and how bad as it is, it has delivered when it needed to deliver in a crisis. And I think that really needs to be acknowledged. It's a really important piece.
Thank you. And just finally, I suppose, could that value for money framework have been put in place any earlier? Where that money could have been used more in prevention and so on? Look, on reflection, could it have been? Yeah, so on reflection, we set, we're hard on ourselves and we set targets for ourselves, and we should be. And so we've asked ourselves the same question. Actually, in all of this in the last number of years, we've added, as I say, thousands of additional temporary accommodation. We've put in place all of the controls and procedures. We've negotiated with landlords in areas. We've never needed, by the way, temporary accommodation, I should have said, across all 11 council areas. So I present to all councils once a year through our housing investment plan, and over the last 2 to 3 years, every year the numbers per council in temporary accommodation, all of you will know we now have temporary accommodation in every constituency or at every council area. So we've done all of that and more and more and more with 69 additional staff. Yeah. So I think, I think personally the answer to your question is we couldn't have, because we simply wouldn't have had the people, the time or the resource to do it. As I say, we did it proactively anyway, working with the Centre for Homelessness Impact, but I think, we weren't in that place. But Catherine? Yeah.
If I could just add, just when you talk about value for money in general, just to outline our general approach to how we manage our budget. Gone back for a number of years, not just in recent times. Obviously, there have been things that have changed homelessness in terms of the shocks. So we have learned and grown, developed our processes, our systems, our people, to manage that, and that has definitely had benefits in terms of value for money. But our general approach to how we manage our budget, because it's not just the direct costs that are involved here in terms of temporary accommodation, and we have made significant savings over the last 3 years. which I can outline for you. But in general terms, our approach is every year we will go to the department, we start our budgeting process a full year before it's due. We will look at everything that we have learned right across the organisation. We will look at how we deliver our services, what are the efficiency savings that we can make, and how then can we feed those in so that we can take money away from the things that maybe manage and operate the services in the background to push money towards frontline. So we break that down every single year and more or less start from scratch to look at what do we need, how are we delivering our services, what changes can we make more use of IT, for example, do we need all of our accommodation as another example, and we build that budget up from scratch. So we have also made significant savings right across the organisation. So what they feed into is the cost of managing the organisation, including homelessness. So it's not just the direct cost, there's also an indirect cost and indirect savings that we have made over the last number of years that are fully documented and fully outlined, and that we report to right through our executive teams to the department to say, here's the savings that we are making year on year, including direct savings on temporary accommodation. And it's an approach that we take very seriously. As Grainia said at the very start, value for money for the public purse right across the board is really important to us.
Your question is exactly the oversight question that I have been asking on Colum's behalf and at his direction over the years in question. And not just asking because of some academic interest in VFM, it's because we had to be sure that our budget, this was challenging our budget as well as the housing executives. We would have to take risks to fund the pressures of non-standard accommodation, and they would only be permissible if we bottomed out that this was the best way. It was an emergency response, but it was the best and only value for money way of responding. And eventually, after going through everything and being very uncosy about it, I was satisfied that there wasn't another way, a better value for money way of their response. Okay, that's eventually where we got.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. John Burrows.
You've kind of answered my first question, which is about the 600 houses.
Yes, yeah.
Whereabouts are they, and just what was the time scale again for actually acquiring them?
Yes, so we're in the process of finalising the go live date, and so the 600 properties will be we'll require 100 next year in the next financial year, 200 in the following year, and 300 in year 3. They are going to be in areas of greatest need for temporary accommodation, so that's where we will start. They will obviously be. We'll want a good spread, obviously, across as many of the council areas as we can. The process that we'll go through will also be dictated by what's out there in the market and what's good value in the marketplace. We will also be looking for properties where there isn't a very significant investment requirement up front, and so we'll be bringing them on using our own change of tenancy works, I suppose, so small amounts of works to the properties. So the go live date will be, as I say, next year, but they will make a really, really significant difference and will, I hope, move us beyond or as close to out of hotel use as we possibly can.
Yeah. Okay, I was interested in the comments you made about the Minister brings extra focus, determination, demands action. Not having an executive for 2 different periods, has that set back progress on the homelessness strategy, and therefore do we have more homelessness than we might have had?
No, I just think there's a different level of bandwidth. I think when there's no minister there, I think the response from the officials has got to be to keep things running as they need to run. I think there's less of it.
The answer is therefore, has it made a difference having no minister for those 2 periods of time?
Of course it's made a difference.
Yes.
It's made it much more difficult.
Yeah,
much more difficult. It's much easier when you have a minister saying, these are my priorities, this is where I want to focus, this is what I want to do, these are the outcomes I want. Once you see that, you can really get in behind that, no difficulty. Whereas when you're working and your powers are limited as well, as you're told to keep the lights on and keep the heat running, but you're basically, there were long periods where we could not do anything new. So that was all very, very difficult, particularly when things were happening which required decisions to be made, and there were lots of legal issues during that time as well. So much, much easier with ministers.
Thanks. Just onto the prevention, and I think everyone's converts onto the theory of prevention. It's cheaper, it's less trauma. But I've been hearing that for like 25, 6, 7 years since I've been in the public sector. Next year we're going to try and get on to prevention, not firefighting. But it never really actually happens. Now, I get the aspect of funding, but see, in terms of culture, leadership, focus, is it a golden thread that goes through everything you do? I mean, if someone went into the deep dive into agendas, meetings, spoke to people in the corridor and said, what are we actually doing about prevention? Is that operationalised in any sense as a core piece of work?
I think there's a really good example of it working, which is that this report itself points out that in terms of those presenting and then assessed as full duty applicants under the homelessness duty in Northern Ireland, unlike anywhere else in the UK since the last report, those numbers have fallen marginally, but they have fallen. Even a flat profile relative to what's happened in the rest of the UK is quite a story, and that is to do with the big strategic prevention decisions that have been taken consistently over the last 10 years, both by ministers when they were there and officials maintaining the footprint of their decisions, which is to protect, at the very least, protect supporting people and to continue investment in new social housing building. Now, we might get on to frustrations with the extent of new social housing build, but its comparison to the rate of new build in other parts of the UK is really positive. It constantly maintains the ability to allocate and take people off the list and take people out of temporary accommodation. And we've also maintained supporting people. Those things have not happened in the rest of the UK. And so in addition to having the temporary accommodation problem that we have, they also have rising demand of presenters and those assessed as FDA. So we have done that. And that's a success that this report points out. And it's to do with maintaining those two really big budgets. That's what they do over the long term.
So the issue about people with mental health conditions and the complexity of that, you talk about your frontline staff having to deal with homelessness now the way it presents and having to deal with a much higher level of complexity than ever before and higher volumes. So you're going to have to invest in prevention to give yourself a chance to actually deal with what's coming, because if you don't, it'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in some senses, sometimes that can leave you to a situation where you almost feel you're running to stand still. But it's the best option that I can see in terms of the research that I've seen on this. This is the best option that I've seen. Also, having seen some of the things in supporting people, having visited some of those to see the work that they do and the difference that it makes, it's incredible. The other bit that's really of interest to me in the question you're asking is when you're looking at family breakdown and how that prevention can happen early enough. And you also have this with your financial officers as well. What you call
inclusion.
Yeah. So you maybe want to share a little bit around that, because I think that's really pertinent to the question.
Yes. So I think because the housing executive is, for the purposes of our budgets, two separate organisations, and just for the purpose of our budget, sometimes we can keep those two separate. But the best way for me to kind of tell you about the culture of the organisation is if you went into one of our area offices on a Monday morning, what you would find, because I've seen it, is, and with a range of different technology, some of them literally are whiteboards and some of them are computer screens, but my colleagues standing around a screen looking at the numbers, who are either A, coming into the office, because Monday mornings are very busy in any public service, or B, looking at the numbers of families or households who are in hotels or in temporary accommodation. And you will have the local team, so the patch managers, sitting alongside or standing alongside our homelessness officers together, looking at how do we find housing solutions for them. And I think that, so when we go and we meet with colleagues from outside Northern Ireland, they say to us, it must be great having a strategic housing authority that's also a public landlord, because we're able to do both, because you have housing officers from the landlord working with housing advisors and central homelessness team. I think that's probably the best descriptor of how you get a culture of prevention.
Shifting away left. You know how much effort is done shifting away left.
Yeah.
So that at the very earliest risk factor. Yes. I mean, is there a spectrum where you say, well, here is at the earliest point that someone's indicating a risk that they might end up homeless, and then there's a spectrum, the other end of it is that person's imminently going to go homeless, whether it's missed rent payments, whether it's addictions, whether it's domestic violence. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get to. Before anyone comes into the door, how do we actually prevent them? So for example, if someone's getting released from prison in 3 months and they have no address to get released to, when does work start on that? I know it's probation service and all sorts of others, but where's the link?
Yes, so that's our custodial housing advisor project. And so that work came about because actually around the Central Homelessness Forum, which is one of the structures that we have in place, which my colleague chairs in the housing executive, the Department for Justice came to us around that table and said, can you help us, because too many people are leaving prison without a housing solution. So we have funded the co-location of housing advisors in prison to enable that to happen, and we're just through that strategic prevention programme. We are now able to scale that up, and I think we've made the decision to fund beyond one prison into 3, and I could be wrong, it could be 4, but I think it's 3. So that's exactly the example of why when you have
we
a
do the
strategic
join up with
prevention
that, John, because our work coaches are in there as well as our Make the Call staff too. So we join forces to make sure there's a holistic response. So not only do they have a roof over their head, they have an option for a job as well, and they know what benefits they're going to have. And there should be a warm handover whenever they go to one of our jobs and benefits offices. They'll be able to see someone they have seen before. That's what we're endeavouring to do.
Okay, that's good. Just two other things. One is around domestic violence, and where you have a couple, they're in a home, let's say there's children, and let's say the perpetrator's male is 90% of them are, victim's female is 90% of them are, and they're in a joint tenancy situation. As it currently stands in the law, if there's domestic violence there, the man has as much rights as the woman to stay in that house. Is that right?
What I will do is I will follow up. I'm always careful about what I say without 100% knowing it, so I will follow up and write through the committee. What I will say to you, because I was going to mention, my next comment was in relation to domestic violence when you talked about upstream, okay? Because again, this is where having a strategic housing authority and a landlord together, we've put together a domestic violence action plan, and we called it a plan because we said enough with strategies, and the plan is very, very clearly focused on how do we prevent homelessness due to violence, okay, and in particular violence against women and girls, and again aligning what we do with the violence against women and girls strategy. In every situation where we can, we want in that situation the woman and her children to be able to stay in the home.
Correct.
Okay, and so we have now have a scheme called our Sanctuary Scheme, where we will provide physical adaptations to that property to keep that woman and her children secure, and that has been very, very successful, and we are now very pleased. We are having conversations with housing associations about potentially some of the housing associations rolling that out, our partners in their organisations. So Sanctuary Scheme has been really, really important. I will come back to you. I don't want to give the wrong advice in relation to that tenancy issue.
I know some women who have ended up homeless because if they there's no choice, they either leave and the husband won't leave, or the partner, or else they stay in the home and get battered because the choice of leaving means they're homeless. So I think it is something that needs, I'm aware of the Sanctuary Programme. I've asked people who aren't aware of it, is there an awareness programme for it?
Yes, there is. Yeah, there is. Now, it is available to our tenants. Okay, so the housing executive landlord pays for that through rental income for its own tenants. So we raise awareness through our own, our tenants magazine and so on. We are also the largest, through the Supporting People programme, we are the largest provider, or the largest funder of accommodation-based services for people who are fleeing domestic violence, and again mainly women. And so we work very closely with Women's Aid and the Women's Aid Network and all of the range of organisations. So for those women and children who do move, and you don't want anyone to have to move, and let's be clear about that, and it is a cause of homelessness, and again to be very clear about that, then of course funding needs to be available and services are available, and so that's some of what we fund through Supporting People. But as a landlord, certainly our
question
would be
one please.
We just to get back to the report, just
just on that, because it's prevention of homelessness is the key, and that final point was just to put it on the record that if organisations like Women's Aid cannot deal with complex needs, and I'm told they can't, therefore women who are victims of domestic violence are often not accepted in Women's Aid because Women's Aid are unable to deal with domestic needs, complex needs.
Yes, so I'm very happy to come directly to you
just on the prevention
some of those
thing.
details. Very, very happy to. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And just you're working closely with Women's Aid and Chair of the Domestic Sexual Violence. Like a lot of the Women's Aid groups are closely working with the Complex Lives Initiative and others there. And are keen to develop on that, and there is a lot of work going on in that space, so I wouldn't want there to be a perception that Women's Aid weren't able to deal with complex needs.
David Hungerford?
And I'll come back to the report. We're looking at supply and delivery of that. into the future. So the strategic ambitions, 2,200 new homes, or new social homes in a year, and we're only seeing about 1,000 starts in this year. What plans are in place to actually meet that target?
I just look in terms of our housing supply strategy that gone to the executive gets agreed, very, very clear in terms of what the right direction of travel is. And I think, as I said earlier on, the executive has a very difficult task then of saying, okay, here's the amount of money that we've actually got in terms of block grant, and here's how we need to carve that up against all of the requirements. We know from the Commission perspective what we need. That goes through the bid process. We make the bid accordingly, and we've, it's fallen short. So we don't sit in our hands and say, well, okay, that's it. There are other things that we're going to try and do. And I want to bring Paul in terms of describing some of the additional things that we're trying to do to compensate for that going forward.
So, I mean, the Minister's recent announcement is the first instalment of the plan. So we're going to try and stretch the grant. We're not just going to sit there and make ever hopeful bids for what is actually a flat capital outlook over the next 4 years. That would be no plan. So we're going to try and stretch the grant. I think the two reviews he announced at the same point. One of them is a review of the grant methodology, so how we subsidise social housing. It will particularly look at how we how we get other sources of finance other than capital Dell to put into social housing. And over the next 4 years, the capital outlook is flat. The outlook for financial transactions capital is not. It increases by about 100%. We're being told to do this, right? We're being told to find other sources of capital by that profile. So the review will get into that. Beyond that, the housing supply strategy is about interventions beyond the social sector and developing a range of products beyond the social sector, which we're already trying to do. So we've got 9,000 homes delivered under the co-ownership scheme to date. Over the next 4 years, there'll be another 4,000, spending, I think, about 153 million of financial transactions capital. We have a new intermediate rent product that will be rolled out shortly, which will deliver its first 300 homes. And we have all the efforts that have been made in the mandate to this point, and still to come in the rest of the mandate, to improve and make better and more sustainable the quality of the private renter sector, which has, as this report makes clear, gone through such a convulsion in the last 5 or 6 years. So, the short answer and summary of all of that is the housing supply strategy, which aims to deliver 100,000 homes over the next 15 years, a third of which should be social.
Yeah, a third of it was social, was it? So
that's what we're pitching for.
30,000. So
32,000, yeah.
So basically, the ambition to reach that is still there. That's kind of getting it. There's no point having a target if we're never actually going to get near that target. So the ambition is still there in other places, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the impact of the shortfall in the short term?
So I think the programme for government contains, if you like, a kind of instalment of that 33,000, or at least I think that governs the thinking there. A target of 5,850. If we remain on the budget we have in 25-26 of 177 million, then by the end of year 2 of that 3-year target, we'll have about 2,500, and we'll be a bit more than that, about 2,600. So we'll be 3,200 short, requiring 3,200 in the final year. I think that would be an enormous challenge. So that immediate target, programme for government target, is I think very, very challenging right now. Let's see what we get in the monitoring round. But I think the important thing is to remain focused on a 15-year long-term plan, which is always what it was going to take. And it was always going to take a pretty complete rethink of how we fund social housing and how we intervene beyond that. That's what we're working on.
So is the shortfall down to a lack of funding solely?
Well, the short-term one. So we're spending
primarily.
We are every year we ask for as much as the new social housing development programme can spend. Every year the Department of Finance give us as much as they can in response in the face of competing priorities. And then every year we take that money and start as many homes as we possibly can with that budget.
And bid like crazy in the meantime.
Yeah.
Well, if the Minister's successful and he has full funding for 2,200 homes and they write him a cheque and they go, there you go, can you deliver 2,200 homes?
We have done.
Yeah.
The programme was delivered. I think it would be pretty close to the maximum amount it's ever delivered, but it's delivered 2,400 in 1 year.
Okay, so it is achievable.
But I think we
we
need to be stretching the capacity of the programme though, and that's really clear. I think its existing capacity is also something that needs to be challenged over the 15 years. That's really important. 33,000 is a 2,500 yearly average over the 15 years. So if we have a slow start, we're going to need to get up to 3,000. We accept that.
But what I'm saying is, funding is, if funding's there, that is there's no other barriers. Wastewater planning, everything, land, all of that doesn't. Is there other barriers there?
Well, 2,200, I think. I think we would be. I'm speaking broadly here. I think we'd be okay. But year on year, and as we need to increase it, you need to also address the barriers of wastewater infrastructure, planning, delays, and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just before I allow Tom and Padraig to come on, it's just a couple of things that have been on throughout the line of questioning. You've repeated a claim that there's been major organisational savings, and that's all fair and good. Where has the money gone, and why has none of it been reallocated towards prevention?
So the savings are 13.8 million, and the savings are on the basis that we have used more sustainable forms of temporary accommodation than the alternative that wouldn't have been available to us. Okay, and so that is a saving in the bid essentially that we made. If we hadn't done that, we would have, to meet our legal obligation, we would have had to bid over those 3 years for an additional 13.8 million. So the saving is in the bid that we would have made.
It's a really important part of balancing the department's budget. I think is where you see it.
So, out of that saving, which has come up as a theme throughout, not a single pound for prevention, which is the root problem. I don't understand how you're going to cure the problem if we're not looking at prevention.
You'd had an imbalance. I mean, I think it wasn't spending power. It was needed to stop the department busting its budget. If it was
being spent, where was
the funding requirement the housing executive would have placed on us would have been that amount greater.
Yeah, 13 greater.
And we would have struggled to fund it.
They've been efficient in what they were doing, is what we're saying.
Yes, there was. So you're saying there was an overspend, and you have curtailed that. Is that? Could you explain that again? I'm focused on the savings that you've talked about the whole way through. So,
So in 2022,
what is the benefit of those savings?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I suppose my view is the same as it was. We in 22-23, by using the housing executive's own domestic voids as dispersed hostels, we saved 2.7 million. That, along with a number of other but much smaller things, we saved 4.5 million in 24-25, 6.6, but that also was added to by, for example, now having HMOs, implementation of the housing and multiple occupation model, and that led us to a total amount that we would otherwise have spent of 13.8.
So you're having less of a funding requirement than if you've been using non-standard temporary accommodation.
Here, what do you think?
There's less of a funding requirement as a consequence in terms of that, so that's the point.
No benefit of the saving then, if it's not go back into prevention. Really?
Well, savings. It's savings. It doesn't necessarily have to go back.
But it's not solving the problem for homelessness.
I suppose, well, I mean, I wouldn't be making that case. The case that I was making was we didn't have to spend 13.8 million on homelessness. We were able to ask for less money from the department.
You've reduced your temporary accommodation spend.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, maybe I could just explain. At the start of the year, we do not get a full allocation. We are dependent on monitoring rounds. So as we move through the year and make those savings, those are taken into account when we resubmit our bids at the time of the monitoring round. So we don't actually get a full allocation at the start of the year and save 13 million or whatever the savings are. We don't save that off. We don't have a full budget of which we save the money. So we will be funded for less as we go through the year. Then we will ask for additional funding. So That is all. Those savings are taken into consideration as we work our way through that financial year until we get to year end. That then is used by the department to build into their overall financial allocations. So at the start of the year, there may be planning to over-planning at the start of the year. As we move through the year and make those savings, then that will all be taken into consideration in the round through our extra monitoring
But they're
rounds.
responding to what we're asking them to do. What we're asking them to do is bring down the cost of temporary
Yes.
accommodation and put in place something that's sustainable.
Funds we're going towards, so the department were content of the care, but not the cure.
Oh, so in that example, for instance, of the list of things I gave earlier of the things we did cut. So that list would have been longer if they hadn't made these savings, and in particular, that particular case, that list would have lengthened into. We'd have had nowhere else to go, but for instance, to look at the protection on supporting people. So if you're asking where the benefit is, there's one example that really important protection of supporting people maintained through these very difficult years. One of the things that's really supported that has been the savings delivered by the housing executive through temporary accommodation.
Being gracious to the department, to be honest. You know, there's a very clear problem here. The very fact that there's no investment in prevention, really, yet there's been savings made, you know, has, in my view, directly contributed to the rising levels of homelessness. So what's the department going to do with that? I know what the housing executive want to do about it. What are the department going to do to ensure the housing executive are properly resourced and funded?
So
prevent.
Back to answer your question, back in 22-23, the housing executive didn't have enough money to fund supporting people. We stepped in and funded that. We stepped in and funded it, and we stepped in and put extra money, as I said earlier on. We put extra money into homelessness prevention.
How much, Colum?
It's about where have we got it?
600 million, I think, wasn't it, in 22-23?
Yeah, it was. So we've done that. We're very proud that we've done that. It was entirely the right thing to do, and we've protected, and our minister since has protected supporting people the whole way through. So we're not out of the woods yet in terms of just starting to come out of that now in terms of temporary accommodation. So this whole report has been about the level of spend in temporary accommodation, and the idea that our minister is not putting anything into homelessness prevention is wrong. Because he is, through supporting people he is, and he's put extra pot of money in, small mate that it is, but he has put it in.
Is that measured properly to ensure that money has been spent well and actually leading to prevention?
Well, we're back to the earlier point that your colleague has asked, where we're looking for a longitudinal view of how well this prevention is actually working on the ground. And
how far into that process?
Well, yeah, so we've been doing that since 22-23, so we put that definition in place, both in terms of the definition of homelessness prevention. So what are the types of interventions that you would count as specifically upstream prevention or prevention? And that's now locked into our own systems. We've agreed it with voluntary community sector partners that we fund, they submit returns. We now have all of that data. We're in the process between March and September of next year of having an ICT platform that enables all that data to tell us the overall aggregate story in terms of what works and what works less well in terms of prevention. And as I said earlier, that will put us in a best foot forward in terms of future bids on prevention. And I think what it will genuinely do also is give us an opportunity to then think, where are those interventions that we have made in particular cohorts of people and groups, and what do we scale up? So what do we do more of, and where do we intervene in different ways for other groups? So whether it's young people ageing out of the care system, we haven't really ever, I would say, across the public sector here, really cracked the issue of that corporate parent role that we all have as public officials in ensuring that a young person, when they age out of the care system on their 18th birthday, and move into the responsibility beyond social services and health to housing and other public services, how do we prevent their homelessness?
So it's not an either-or question for us, Chair, it's both. So there was a stage in here where we had to put everything into the statutory piece, which was temporary accommodation. Now, as we come out of that, we're seeing more of an opportunity to blend what happens with temporary accommodation, because you're putting in place a much more affordable configuration of what temporary accommodation should be, and that we have prevention that goes alongside that. That's the key to this. But we're back here to John's question. I think as do we really know how well we are actually doing that prevention. Do we know what the quality of that is really like? And the only way we can do that is put in place the right measures, and we haven't really had that well enough, I think, for long enough.
Yeah, but I'm just looking at that on the bare facts of this whole situation. You know, temporary accommodation was the treatment for the problem, but the cure was investment in prevention. The department are happy to take the sticking plaster approach over actually implementing something that will prevent the problem. That's an issue. Homelessness in Northern Ireland, upward.
So presentations are down. We're the only
Slightly?
jurisdiction.
Very
It's been
slightly.
no, it's been flat for a number of years, and it has gone
static, probably.
down. No, I mean the audit office report says it has come down. It has come down.
And the levels of money invested in prevention, downward.
No, I would say up, because when you take supporting
Up.
people funding,
The
plus
prevention money
really-
is increased,
Yeah.
but homelessness is static.
Well, so prevention funding, homelessness presentations have been static, and they have come down, okay? So they've been static since COVID, but actually in advance of COVID, homelessness prevention homeless presentations have come down. And I think it's very important that you ask that question, how much is prevention impacting on presentations? But I think we are talking about two completely different cycles now, and like, to be fair, so you're going into a pandemic with a certain number. We've had 3 shocks since. If I can go back to the previous point, having been accused of being kind to the department, I actually think there's a slightly separate issue here, which is my understanding, and we went through a very, very rigorous process in 22-23, and particularly in 23-24 in terms of our budget. Very rigorous, I would say. Catherine and I meeting officials in the department over many hours, over many, many weeks. And every line in our budget was looked at many, many times. And my own view of this would be, Colum, I would slightly disagree, is that I actually think what the department did was it held off on increasing or funding vacancies in the department to enable us to push money to frontline services. I actually said that publicly, and I think that was the right decision. And I would have said it if I felt it was the wrong decision. I also think it was right that the department funded supporting people, but it is the department's programme, so it should have done that. So I'm being challenging as well as being kind, I guess. But I think everybody, that year was a really tough year. And I think in all of this, what we were also concerned about was how do we fund the voluntary community sector organisations that are putting those services to the people who need them most. So, whatever way you look at this, there hasn't been enough revenue or capital subsidy. We have made, I'm really pleased with those numbers of 13.8 million. I think they will go up. I mean, they are on a trajectory to go up this year. But I think, to challenge back, if I can, the cure is social housing. It is also prevention, but it is social housing at scale, relentlessly, for 15 years. And it is also, alongside that, affordable housing, intermediate housing. You've seen the numbers. So we do our 15-year housing market assessment, and that advised the housing supply strategy and all of the local development plans. And actually, ironically, strange thing for the housing chief executive to say, if we only focus on social housing, ironically, all that does is it puts more pressure on the social housing waiting list. We've got to have other options. So intermediate housing, key worker housing, if you want to call it, housing where you can provide a solution for people who are on low income but working, and who won't ever have the points to get social housing, but could afford something at 80% market rate, or could afford shared ownership. That's what other jurisdictions do. We have got to do it. We've never cracked it. 300 home pilot is very important. We have to learn lessons from that, but we have to learn the lessons really fast, and we have to go so fast beyond 300 in the next 10 to 15 years, because we'll never get the waiting list figures truly down if we don't have other choices for people beyond social housing. So that's shouldn't be taken as not having social housing as a solution. The numbers are there, but we have got to get other products in as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's just throughout the line of questioning, this is coming up in my mind. So in real terms, it's not really a saving, Grainia. You've learned to live within your allocated budget, really.
A hell of a top up during it.
It's improved value for money.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's improvement, but I'm saying savings for me is that you have this excess cash that you could reinvest elsewhere.
I'll get that.
Fair enough.
That's the point I was making.
Yeah, but we were asked to achieve value for money in the provision of homeless service
I've no
at a time of
dispute.
acute crisis. And we
Reduction is reduction, but I, to me, you know, having excess money there to invest in other areas, the cure is much better use of public money. But yes, I get it. That's why I went after that issue.
But it retains spending power in the department.
Yeah.
And the department had options to spend it on things that compete well, even with the really logical case for strategic prevention for homelessness, like supporting people, which is preventing homelessness.
And our minister does have a burning frustration that he doesn't have enough money for social housing.
Yeah. Okay. So, Colum wants in briefly, and then we'll go to
just a wee brief one on something you said there, Grainia. A wee note of concern. You'd mentioned about looked after children at age 18. Has best practice and indeed legislation not even changed to move that looked after children in protection, given they're so vulnerable, to more like 25? And are the housing executive taking account of that? Given their needs, because it's very young to be pitching somebody out.
So just for the avoidance of doubt, given that it's a public forum, so what I was talking about was the point at which the health, the responsibility from social service and health services then pass across to other public agencies, if you know what I mean. And that's the point at which we too often see, less now, but still too often see young people fall in between the gaps in services at that point. And that's what New Foundations is all about. It's about systems change. So how do we get much earlier conversations between health trusts, housing executive, other public agencies, so that we're planning housing solutions for young people really from their 14, 15, 16.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tom Buchanan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here today and taking all the questions. And back just as I was listening to the Chair and this issue of the 13.8 million, to me it seems to be a paper exercise rather than actual delivery on the ground. But look, let's get back to social housing. Since 2017, over 3,200 homes have been sold under the housing sales scheme. And as I understand it, the proceeds of this scheme are not being reinvested into building new social housing. Why is that?
I mean, by and large, they are. They score as a capital receipt to.
Right, Paul. Just for Hansard, can you just speak into the mic, because they'll find it difficult to pick up what you're saying.
By and large, they are. We see the effect of them in an increased capital allocation to DfC. The problem is that the sale proceeds, they still leave a gap. I mean, they don't fund, you don't get one for one. A new social home now costs about 200,000, 206,000 for a two-bedroom home. The proceeds from a discounted sale under the right to buy will be much less than that.
Yeah, so you're more or less saying that the proceeds of the sale scheme is going back into the
route. It's
social housing.
It's the disposal proceeds fund, isn't it?
Well, I suppose the house sales scheme, so the housing executive house sales scheme, the number of homes that we sell every year, is previously we would have been allowed to retain those capital receipts, and those capital receipts essentially go into the reserve of the landlord, and we can use that reserve for a number of things, and we have tended to use it for adaptations for people, for our tenants who have disabilities or illness that require their homes to be adapted. This year is the first year in which those receipts are not retained, and that has put significant pressure on the landlord reserve, and we have had to fund adaptations from the existing reserve. So that is a source of concern for me as accounting officer. Catherine, is there anything you want to add?
No, just that, that can be quite a substantial amount of money every year. This year, for example, our adaptations programme is sitting at around £12 million. So as Grainia says, we have to find a different way of funding that, and we don't retain those capital receipts anymore. We used to bid for those capital receipts, as we still do bid, and we always will. But unfortunately, we weren't allocated those receipts, so that does put pressure on the finances on the landlord side.
What implications is that having then for the development of new social housing?
So, well, I suppose if I just talk in relation to the housing executive, and then I'm sure the department will want to. This is an area of disagreement, and I have to say this as a landlord. So, every social landlord, you manage your balance sheet so carefully because you're retaining rental income, and you're retaining rental income to improve the homes of your tenants. And so, every penny I spend, it has to be in the interest of those tenants and the future stability of their homes, keeping them safe, warm and dry in their homes. And so we're in a situation where we have no choice but to sell our homes at a discount. That discount in 23-24 amounted to 8.3 million. There's 8.3 million off our balance sheet. Okay, plus we lose the homes, plus we lose the rental income over a 30 to 45 year business plan. All of that added up, and now on top of it, we don't get to retain the receipts. So that has a really material impact on us, on the landlord. As well as that, as a landlord, we want to be in a position in the next few years where we borrow against that asset in order to fund new homes. So I'm giving you an indirect question that has a direct bearing on our balance sheet today, but it will have in the future when we're hopefully in a position to borrow as a public landlord. It reduces the number of homes we can borrow against. It reduces our borrowing capacity. So that's the direct effect for the housing executive, and why the board of the housing executive does not, believes that the house sales scheme should no longer apply to the housing executive.
And it does, on an everyday basis, prevent us. That's money we cannot invest in our homes, quite simply. And we need as much money as possible to invest in our homes. And as Grainia says, that's exactly why the revitalisation programme and outline business case is sitting there.
So we don't dispute any of that. But what happens to that funding is it effectively becomes part of the department's capital budget. We get the receipt, and in any typical year, we will spend 80% of our capital budget on new social housing. So it doesn't work for the housing executive at all, but it is producing new social homes.
Chair, we'll write to you about this and set this out to clarify.
I think members would be keen on the process. Grainia, you did lay it out extremely well there. Fascinating, actually. So if that clarification could be provided with the other bits and pieces, that would be very helpful.
You can do
Thank
that.
you, Colum. Thank you. Tomas, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. With the reduction in social housing stock, what is the medium to long-term homelessness service pressures, including temporary accommodation?
So, over the last 9 years, housing need in Northern Ireland has increased by 80%, 80. And that is taken from our housing...
80,
yes.
880?
Okay.
Yeah.
So it has increased by 80% in the last 9 years, and that is on the basis of our, essentially, housing market assessment, which we've undertaken every year since the housing executive has been in existence. And so we take those numbers and we use those numbers to predict the next 15 years. And as I say, that 15-year assessment sets out the just under 100,000 homes that we need, and then it splits it between social and affordable housing. And so the total need across all 10 years for the next 15 years is 95,000, and that's split between 25,000 social, 15 intermediates, that's affordable housing, and 54,000 market. And we can split that, which we do, and I have it in front of me, and we publish this, by the way, it's public data, across each council area, and that's why I present to all 11 councils. That data is used to inform local development plans and plan policies for planning teams in each of the local authorities, and that then in turn also we furnish to housing associations, to developers, to anyone interested in developing land, to enable them to see where are the areas that we would support new social housing development. We're a statutory consultee. The housing executive works in development management and development planning. We're a statutory consultee, so anybody applying to a planning committee for new build, that planning committee will seek our advice, our statutory advice, as to whether we can support that scheme.
And so you're satisfied then you have a strategy in place to meet that need over the next 15 years?
Well, from a housing executive point of view, we're certainly satisfied that we know the numbers. The housing supply strategy, which Paul has outlined, which belongs to the department, has taken those numbers and has set and is putting an action plan together.
Which you fed into. Yeah.
Oh no, and by the way, just for the avoidance of it, I completely 100% support, and the housing executive will be and is the key driver of that. But just to give you a technical answer, the numbers are very, very clear and are fed into the supply strategy. But yes, absolutely. It's not going to happen without us.
We have the right strategy. It's a challenge to deliver it, and one of the challenges is budget, but we definitely have the right strategy.
Again, in looking at the escalating temporary accommodation costs, is enough actually been made of unoccupied properties across the whole social housing sector?
So, I suppose no is the answer. However, I think I'll always urge, I suppose as a housing professional, caution in relation to the extent to which unoccupied homes can be used at scale to meet housing need. And mainly the reason for that is they are very, very expensive to bring back into use. However, I'm also conscious in the Republic of Ireland today, they're just launching a new housing plan, which is very, very focused actually on bringing vacant homes back into use. And they are putting significant resource into vacant property grants and bringing homes back into use. So look, we used to, as the housing executive, have a programme which was about bringing vacant properties back into use. We had grants available. That is no longer in place. We no longer have funding for that, and it's not. I don't know if it's a funding issue. It hasn't been a policy area that we've had responsibility for a number of years. But certainly, when we look to other jurisdictions, I think there's a case for it being part of the overall package of measures sitting alongside new build.
Just one final question, Chair. How do you monitor and report the voids across all the forms of social housing?
Do you want to answer across others and I can cover?
You do. I'll do RHAs.
Yeah. So the housing executive, we as a landlord, 83,000 homes, 84,000 homes, and we have very low number of voids. Our total number of voids is 0.4% of all of our stock. Okay, we have very clear targets for void management, as we should do. We set high targets for ourselves, and our teams measure those. Because every home that's void that doesn't have somebody living in it is somebody on the waiting list unnecessarily. So void management is a really, really important part of ensuring that we have housing supply. So we have 16,054 voids. But 351 of those are actionable. So an actionable void is a home that would normally be used and is empty for some reason. It's usually between tenancies, so we're undertaking change of tenancy works. All of the others are properties that are either empty for redevelopment. So we have a very, very large redevelopment in North Belfast at the moment, Upper Long Streets. We have tower blocks, a small number of tower blocks that are currently units that are being held as void for demolition. But really, they're very, very, very low numbers. The vast majority of our so a very low number of voids, and as I say, 351 are actionable and will be brought back into use, change of tenancy within weeks.
So housing associations are independent, but we regulate them. And one thing we regulate them for is performance on voids. We ask them to keep voids at a level below 4% of their portfolio. They're meeting that target. Their level of voids is proportionately, it's not as high performing as the housing executive, it's slightly higher. In 23-24, they had 473 lettable voids out of their portfolio, so that's less than 4%. About half were void for up to 6 months. About half were void for beyond 6 months, up to 12 months. A few into a second year. Can they be a source of temporary accommodation? So 60 are already being used. We've accepted the recommendation actually to develop, the housing executive has, to develop a plan to see if we can increase that. It's difficult because they are a moving target. So what we're going to do is look at ways in which the regulatory function can maybe collect more information on voids. That may improve the rate at which a void property returns to social supply, which would be a good thing. It may or may not open up a way to increase the use of them as temporary accommodation. Does that answer your question?
The difficulty is the longer you let a house lie void, the more money it takes in to make it livable again for somebody to come in and move into it. So it's much better if you can keep them houses occupied whenever there's a need that's so evident in front of you.
Catherine's looking in briefly, just in, yeah.
Just one point that the members raised, sorry if we finished with that one, just at the very start in terms of efficiencies. I know the whole budgeting process, being that it's not dealt with in cash terms, is difficult. However, I would say we have absolutely made cost savings, so I'll call them just directly cost savings, actual cost savings, which represent savings to the public purse. And the reason I just want to emphasise the point is it's a painful exercise every year. It is not easy. It is very difficult. And culturally, as an organisation, we have moved to the point where it's how we work, but there are actual significant cost savings on a year-on-year basis. So I just want to make that point. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
And that's linked to the point about voids, actually, because 220 void housing executive properties have been used as temporary accommodation. Yeah. So we're currently using those. That's not within the figure I gave you. So that outside of that, we have 220, and that has been hugely important. And we have saved money to the public purse for making those voids available. Big savings.
Grant, this is a wee bit relevant to Tom's point. What about the level of tenancy fraud that may exist? People that are saying they're separated from a partner and the two of them have a house up and down the street or whatever. What is the percentage of that?
Do you want me to come in there?
Please do, if you can find the number before me, Paul, that would be great.
Yes, I can. But the numbers are generally quite low relative to the size of the portfolio, and as a potential impact on, say, for instance, the temporary accommodation issue. In any typical year, I think you have about 300 cases, the suspected cases, with about half confirmed after investigation.
Yeah, so we had in April to 1st of April to 31st of March last year, 752 cases of suspected fraud, and I can give you the breakdown of those, but the majority were related to abandonment and non-occupation, so that's 635. During the last year, we recovered a total of 169 properties that were subject to tenancy fraud. So again, that point around not just watching your voids, but also watching unoccupied properties, bringing those back into use. That's a high level of performance on our part in relation to constantly watching out for fraud. And understandably, and you might feel, well, if there's 752 suspected cases and you're only recovering 169, well, first of all, not all of them will be. They'll be suspected fraud, but they won't be fraud. But also, understandably, there's a very, very high test, and there should be very high bar that any landlord should reach before you remove somebody's tenancy. Is a really, really significant thing to do somebody. So to remove a tenancy, because it's a tenancy, not just the property, you will no longer be a tenant. There's a very, and that affects everybody in the family. So if you're the child of somebody who is found guilty of fraud, then you lose your tenancy as a child. So we recovered those 169, but we do that, as I say, there's a high test and there should be a high test.
Yeah, I've no doubt it's an extremely complex legal situation to fall into, although albeit a significant saving for the public purse if someone is found in that situation, not just in terms of redeeming the property and getting it to a family that needs it, but equally through housing benefit in some occasions. So just a final, very brief point on this. How do you inspect? What's the mechanism in each council area or whatever way?
Yes, so it's a core part of the job role of a patch manager. Housing executive, housing officer or patch manager has a group of an area that they are responsible for, and it is their job to manage the properties in those areas to make sure that they are maintained. Well, first of all, to make sure they're occupied, to make sure they're maintained, and so it's in a patch manager's job description. They will work very closely with the rest of the local team. If they have any concerns, they will deal with that proactively. We will do visits, we will knock on doors, we'll speak to neighbours, we'll speak to local community representatives, we'll speak to elected representatives sometimes, we will speak to other public agencies to understand, is somebody living there? Sometimes there are genuine and real reasons, and we're able to manage those carefully, and where we do find fraud, then we will take that forward. But often it's the act of doing that work that resolves the issue.
Chair, we will legislate this mandate to extend the power the housing executive has to investigate its own cases of tenancy fraud into the housing association sector. That power doesn't exist at this point, and that will be really helpful in addressing their fraud cases.
If it's helpful, we can summarise this for you, and we can write to you and summarise this.
Okay, let's go. Thank you. Audit?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for your answers so far. So there are 4 key points that I want to raise, and I suppose the first one of them is just moving on from your definition earlier, Grainia, around the fact that purely looking at social homes isn't going to be the only solution here, that we need to look at affordable homes as well. And I suppose for me, there's therefore a contradiction in properties being sold, in terms that you're kind of just shifting or apportioning that lack of housing to a different part of the budget. So I do see a contradiction, as Colum and Cahill have mentioned on that. What are the department doing to ensure that affordable homes are made available within this mandate, and is there any sort of time-bound actions?
Okay, we can talk to you about the pilot that's going on, yeah?
Yeah, so we have, so beyond the social sector, we have a range of affordable home products. I've mentioned them. So we have the co-ownership scheme. I mean, over the last few years, of all the financial loan finance available, public loan finance available to the Northern Ireland Executive, we have spent 75% of it on co-ownership, and it's delivered, I think, 9,000 homes at this point. We've secured 150 million for the next 4 years to secure to deliver another 4,000. So it's co-ownership. We've launched a new affordable product, intermediate rent. I say launched it, but it should start providing its first 300 houses. Maple and May have been appointed. That will start rolling out from now, and we hope that will use again FTC. This is not competing with the kind of funding that currently goes into social housing, and we hope to expand that going forward. And then you've got the range of things that have been done in the private rented sector to try and improve the kind of guarantees that and security that tenants need. So you've minimum energy and fire safety standards. To this point in the mandate, the guarantee that they can only have one rent increase in every 12 months. And then in the remainder of the mandate, the Minister will regulate to deliver the extended notice to quit, significantly extending the amount of notice the landlord would need before they serve a notice to quit upon a tenant. So it's a range of things addressing, the wider housing market, and the housing supply strategy takes a longer term view of that over the next 15 years.
I suppose there's 2 points within that I'm interested in, and those schemes are obviously beneficial and have real potential. But the 2 elements that I'm interested in are specifically what are your KPIs within those. So how do you measure whether or not those have been successful? But also, like, I'm 29 myself, and I know a lot of my friends who are also in a position where they're buying houses at the minute. None of them know about these schemes. So what's the marketing strategy around that? How's the word getting out on that? Because, like, I know when I'm talking to people about this, that they're looking at me with a blank face. They've never heard of them, and that would be a worry of mine.
So we set ourselves targets in the departmental business plan, and indeed in the programme for government, on housing supply. So we will have our target on co-ownership to make sure we get the budget out this year. But I suppose that doesn't address your wider point. If these kinds of interventions are not broadcast, we need to look at. I better take that away and come back to you on it, because it needs addressing.
I'm moving beyond a pilot to try and drive it out at standard scale. A bigger scale is really the essence of the question as well. So there's a lot of ambition required in that, and back to the funding question as well. There's a lot of funding going to have to put in behind that as well. It is the right direction of travel, and you made that point earlier. We do need affordable homes, and we need them at scale. Yeah. So I think you're right to ask the question, and it's a very pertinent one.
Yeah. Just moving on from that, obviously, next 15 years there's an ambition to build 67,000 new homes, a departure from 100,000 new homes, which had been Deirdre Hargey's ambition. So for me, a departure, but also a failure in terms of delivering as many homes as there should have been. But in terms of delivering those, what are the quantifiable measures associated with that? What are the monitoring arrangements? How will that be monitored monthly, yearly, longer term, short, medium and long term, to make sure that those targets are being met? Because we don't want to get the situation in 2039 where we're looking back and saying this target hasn't been met.
So we're working on that right now. So the housing supply strategy was agreed by the executive in December 24. So since then we are preparing the action plan to govern the first 3 years. So I'll be the SRO of the programme. So those are the questions I will be asking, and I'm currently asking other departments to give me commitments that I can measure in exactly the terms you're saying. Just to be clear, the target is 100,000. Target hasn't changed. So the 67,000 figure would describe the non-social element that is targeted within that big target, the remaining third being the social element.
That's reassuring, and I suppose my last point, Chair, just with your indulgence, is just the point that I always make, and I make regularly with education. I'm a former teacher myself, and every time I'm looking at new schools being built, it really frustrates me, because they're looking at the data that's there now and the statistics that are there now, rather than the trends and the projections. So I suppose I'm looking for an assurance on whether or not the trends are being taken in and the projected figures rather than the current statistics.
So the Grainia earlier talked about the strategic housing market analysis, and its assessment of need over the next 15 years is actually just over 25,000, about 1690 a year. So that's basically a very flat. That's if nothing changes. So what we've done in our housing supply strategy, in quite a sort of informal way, you know, in discussions with stakeholders, is our 33,000, if you like, represents an acceptance that things are going to happen demographically over that period. So, and we will just review that and see how wise that assumption looks and whether it needs changing as the 15 years unfold. We've tried to do that.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose just in terms of getting a more solid commitment on that, because I appreciate that there is an ambition to do that, but how can we get a more solid commitment to do that, to look at those trends and to reevaluate those as time goes on? Because I know, like, even in the last couple of years, you've mentioned like 3 sort of waves. So, like, how often is that going to be updated, looked at, reviewed, so on?
Yeah. Okay. So we better come back to it. I can't be glib. I can't just say I know the answer to that right now. I agree with you. It's really, really important. The first review of the action plan, which will be towards 27, 28, needs to answer your question.
It's a thoughtful question. We'll give it a thoughtful answer.
Good. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just a very final question from me, and it's about avoiding the crisis cliff edge for homelessness. So, officially, someone isn't homeless until literally they're out the door and present at the housing executive. What's the best way of dealing with that to avoid that crisis situation where someone has to appear at the 11th hour? I suppose after losing their home is probably the best.
Well, I suppose in the vast majority of cases we would want to avert that at every stage, okay? So we will always say to people, get in touch with us as early as you possibly can. That doesn't mean we can assist you the day you want us to, because our duty kicks in where, within 28 days with somebody losing their home, or so we have a duty to assist in advance of that. And so, but it would always be our view that let us know as early as possible. It allows us to plan. It allows us to. There's housing advice is available, and we often find actually that what people think is the worst case scenario can be averted by putting people in touch with the right kind of organisation, the right kind of agency. So that's the first thing I would say. We also fund, and as we should do, a number of housing organisations in the voluntary community sector who also provide, as well as us, housing advice, housing solutions work. And there are, including, for example, tenancy deposit schemes available for people who are concerned about their ability to afford a deposit. So I would say get in touch as early as you possibly can, and that will give us the best possible opportunity to plan for you and with you.
That's great. You have went through 2 hours and 15 minutes of questioning, so I don't think we've any further ones, but I can't let you leave without a comment from the CNIHE. Have you anything to add? No? Stuart?
Nothing from me, Chair.
It's not like you, Stuart.
I have a wee point to make.
Okay.
Just because it's interesting you brought the issue up about the recovering the tenancies in terms of potential fraud. And if we're to address some of that as part of our report, we need to look across the departments in terms of responsibility. And obviously I know myself working within my own area and in terms of council, and it's a high threshold in terms of tenancy, we evict or not, I know that. But if we're to get this right, we need to work right across the board, and it needs to be reflected. That's all I'm saying, because I know you're saying that, to be fair, Colum, talking to the permanent secretaries, but there's also an element of work, because when you get down to that level, and we're talking about crime and fraud here, we need to address it properly, because all those factors is the sum of the parts at the minute, and there's severe pressure on all of us collectively.
Thanks. Cathal, just Colum, you're retiring. Am I allowed to say that now?
You can say it, yeah.
When's your last day?
Technically, it's the end of December, but it's a date yet to be uncovered. So it just depends what the priorities are. I will be away before that.
Right. And how many years have you been with the civil service?
I've been in public service 40 years. I've been in the civil service 20. So I've been in the SAS since 2005.
Well, on behalf of the committee and indeed the Assembly, we want to wish you well in your retirement, a very hard-earned retirement. That's an incredible contribution to the public, and we sincerely want to thank you.
I appreciate it.
And for being with us today, and wish you and your family well and a well-deserved retirement.
Okay, thank you very much.
Grainia, thanks very much to you and your team. Grainia, I just want to put on the record as well, all of us engage with House Executive more frequently than we'd like to be, but I have to say the teams are exceptional. They work hard in very difficult situations, and I would be very appreciative on behalf of this committee if you would pass on our sincerest appreciation to the people at the coalface dealing with very sensitive, very difficult, very challenging circumstances. We are deeply appreciative for that, for their efforts, and of course your leadership and leadership of your team. So thank you to you all, and it is very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Members, I think it's worth noting that we have a further evidence session scheduled to take place on the 27th of November with Homeless Connect, so we look forward to that. And just before we move into the closed session, I think we'll move into the closed session. Okay, we'll move into the closed session here. Was it? Yeah.
Senate Chamber. Sound. Senate Chamber. Sound.